Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we aren't easing into history so much as plunging headfirst into a contemporary nightmare, one still unfolding beneath a suffocating canopy of green in Central America. You are flying low, strapped into the cramped, vibrating belly of a surveillance chopper, the humid air of the Darien Gap pressing in around you like a physical weight. Below, the jungle is an endless emerald carpet, beautiful and utterly unforgiving, a place where maps go to die and where cartographers simply draw a blank line, acknowledging defeat. The only thing you can hear right now, aside from the whirring rotor blades, is the frantic thump of your own heart, a rhythm that's becoming increasingly erratic the closer you get to the designated coordinates. You wipe a smear of sweat and condensation from the observation window, and the jungle floor, moments before a uniform mass, fractures into something horrific. You probably won't survive this, not because of the bugs or the bandits, this place has plenty of both, but because of the thing you're here to witness, a phenomenon so fundamentally wrong, it makes every survival instinct you possess scream for retreat. It's the story of the entity in Panama, the one that keeps growing, silently, relentlessly, defying every law of physics and biology we thought was immutable. This isn't some blurry photo taken by a shaky tourist. This is a highly classified, active threat. Now you're an embedded observer, your presence officially sanctioned but unofficially irrelevant. You're just another piece of data they want collected before whatever comes next. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is, and we can all share this sleepless uncertainty together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The chopper banks sharply, throwing your shoulder against the harness. The pilot, whose name you don't know and whose face is concealed by night vision goggles, grunts into his mic. Target in sight. Looks like last time. Maybe bigger. Understated military communication is always the most chilling, isn't it? It's always the quiet ones, the ones who talk in clinical reports, who see the worst things. You lean in, trying to peer through the atmospheric haze and the dense jungle mist, and then you see it. It doesn't look like an alien spaceship, nor does it resemble any sort of classic sci-fi monster. Instead, it looks like a colossal, festering bruise on the face of the Earth. It's an area of total ecological deadness, a perfectly circular, deepening black spot that absorbs the ambient light. The canopy simply stops, not cut down, but consumed. Around the perimeter, the trees don't fall. They are twisted, desiccated husks standing in mute skeletal protest, drained of every drop of chlorophyll and life force, their wood bleached white like sun-dried bone. This bleached ring gives way abruptly to a centre that can only be described as a liquid void. Imagine pouring a bucket of ultra-dense, semi-viscous crude oil onto a perfectly flat, absorbent surface. That is the core of the entity, except it is also three-dimensional, rising perhaps 20 feet at its peak, and pulsing with a barely perceptible, unsettling rhythm. It is constantly churning, the surface occasionally rippling like disturbed mercury, yet there's no wind to move it. It's an independent, self-motivating liquid mass, and its growth is the core of the terrifying update you're here for. It's not just spreading outwards, but upwards, seemingly gaining mass from nothing. You recall the initial, almost comical reports that filtered out through unauthorized channels. A few local loggers reported a tar pit that ate the ground. Then came the photos of a newly paved access road, built just weeks prior, that simply dissolved into black sludge overnight. The government's first response, naturally, was to blame a geological sinkhole and a massive, uncatalogued oil seep. But oil doesn't grow. Sinkholes don't expand by meters every hour, drawing in everything from rock to water to atmospheric moisture and processing it into more of itself. This entity is located in one of the most geographically challenging places on the planet, the Darien Gap. This 60-mile stretch of roadless, hostile swampland and mountains has historically served as the only break in the 30,000-mile Pan-American highway system. It's a zone of legend, known for drug trafficking, migration routes, and, until now, as a purely natural barrier. Historians still argue whether the gap was deliberately left unconquered by engineers to act as a geopolitical buffer between North and South America, or if the terrain simply defeated every human attempt at control. Either way, The sheer difficulty of operating here adds a layer of impossible complexity to the current crisis. As your helicopter hovers, the air crackles with an unnatural static. Your comms officer, a young man named Reyes, nervously checks his environmental monitors. Energy signatures are spiking again, Captain. Looks like a wide-band absorption field. Nothing recognizable. This is one of the quirkier tidbits of information surrounding the site. Standard radio frequencies, satellite communication, and even basic light waves entering the entity's core area are either absorbed or returned as garbled, meaningless white noise. They theorize it is consuming not just matter, but potentially the very energy fields that hold the jungle together. It's like a sponge for reality. You notice a detail in the dead zone that wasn't visible on the satellite imagery. About 100 yards from the black mass, a massive, antique-looking bulldozer is perfectly preserved. It's completely drained of colour, its metal surfaces dusted with that same chalky white powder that covers the tree husks. The blades are sunk into what was once mud, now hardened into an unearthly, petrified cement. It's a monument to the first containment effort, a military operation codenamed Project Obsidian, that tried to build a simple earth barrier around the entity to slow its spread. The equipment didn't sink, it just stopped functioning. Its fuel, lubricants and rubber tyres seemingly reduced to inert dust in an instant. It makes you think of the famous Tunguska event in 1908 Siberia, a mainstream historical fact often attributed to a massive airburst from a comet or meteoroid. That blast levelled 80 million trees over 2,150 square kilometres, but it left no impact crater and no physical debris. In contrast, the Panama entity is leaving behind a distinct absence of life and a single, constantly growing physical mass. Tunguska was an explosion of energy. This thing is an implosion of matter. It's the ultimate counterpoint, yet it carries the same terrifying sense of cosmic indifference to human life. Reyes taps your shoulder, his voice strained. Captain, the infrared is showing a temperature drop in the surrounding jungle canopy, 5 degrees over 2 minutes. It's drawing heat again. You see it now, the silent, visible mechanism of its growth. Along the edges of the dark pool, tiny, nearly invisible tendrils of the black liquid are extending, not crawling, but flowing over the ground, reaching into the root systems of the surrounding life. As they touch the vibrant green jungle floor, the colour seems to be physically sucked out, leaving behind the pale, petrified earth and the chalky, dead wood. The black mass at the centre simultaneously rises by an imperceptible fraction. This is the terrifying update. The growth rate is not linear, it's exponential. The more it consumes, the larger its surface area, and the faster it can consume more. It's a runaway reaction, a geological cancer. The mission parameters suddenly become very clear. Your job isn't to study the entity, it's to confirm the geometric progression of its mass increase, and to document the continued failure of Project Obsidian. You're here to look into the void and report that the void is, in fact, getting thicker. It's not moving with speed, but with the cold, inexorable patience of a geological process. You could, quite literally, sit here and watch the world turn to dust. That is the kind of slow-burn dread that gets under your skin and stays there, far more effectively than any jump scare. Your mind drifts, a nervous defence mechanism, to that little-known fringe tidbit about the failed French attempt to build the Panama Canal decades before the Americans succeeded. The French effort was utterly decimated by yellow fever and malaria, diseases that thrived in the very swamps and jungles that now host this entity. They literally gave up on the project because millions of tiny biological invaders, mosquitoes, were more powerful than French engineering and finance. Now a single, colossal biological entity is achieving what the mosquitoes, the mud, and the mountains could only dream of. It is consuming the potential for any future highway, any future civilization, and indeed, any future life, right out of the continent. The irony is bitter enough to taste. You think, maybe the jungle just really hates infrastructure. That was your first light joke of the night, a nervous internal hiccup that instantly dissolves under the oppressive shadow below. The pilot gets permission to drop lower for a thermal scan. As you descend, the oppressive, sucking silence of the entity seems to rise to meet you. The only sound is the mechanical clatter of the chopper, and for a terrifying second, you wonder if that sound will be the next thing to be absorbed in silence forever. You clutch the cold aluminum of your flight box, the air thick with the smell of ozone and wet decay. The thermal scan complete, the chopper pulls away from the oppressive energy-draining shadow below, and you feel the collective tension in the cabin ease just slightly. It's like pulling a mosquito out of a jar of molasses. The resistance is palpable. Reyes, the comms officer, reviews the data with a grimace. Mass density increase confirmed, Captain. At this rate, we lose the first perimeter checkpoint within 72 hours. And the absorption field is fluctuating. It's not a steady drain, it's hungry. You lean over to see the thermal image. The entity is a perfectly cold centre surrounded by concentric rings of increasing warmth, suggesting it's drawing heat energy from the surrounding environment in efficient wave-like pulses. It's actively engineering its local climate, making the jungle shiver in its shadow. But how did this all start? This immense growing blot on the landscape wasn't simply beamed down in a blinding flash of light. No, its arrival, or perhaps its emergence, was far more subtle, filtering up through the mud and the bureaucracy like a slow, toxic seep. You begin piecing together the timeline, a frantic relay of events that began with a lone survey team. It was a small crew, comprised of 3 contracted geologists and 1 wildlife photographer, hired by a multinational agricultural firm. A classic case of corporate reconnaissance gone terribly wrong. They were looking for flat, dry areas suitable for large-scale palm oil development, deep within the relatively untouched eastern edge of the Darien. You can imagine them. Professionals, yes, but also tired, swatting at mosquitoes the size of hummingbirds trudging through the relentless humidity. Their GPS units constantly glitching beneath the triple canopy. It was the photographer, a nervous young woman named Elena, who saw it first. Not the entire mass, but a ripple. She was setting up a time-lapse shot of an ancient ceiba tree, a natural monument, when she noticed the ground around the tree's immense root system seemed to be weeping a tar-like substance. It was shiny, unnaturally uniform, and it wasn't flowing downhill. It was spreading outwards in all directions, ignoring gravity and gradient. When the geologist, Dr. Alistair Finch, knelt to test it, he reported that it wasn't oil. It was cold to the touch, and when he tried to collect a sample, the material seemed to actively resist the container, like 2 magnets pushing against each other, only sticking to the metal of the scoop itself with surprising tenacity. They assumed a complex petrochemical leak from an undocumented pipe or an unusual low-temperature magma seep. They took photos, the first clear images, showing the substance spreading out, covering an area about the size of a small car. The moment they uploaded those images to their remote satellite link, the clock started ticking, and the information chain began its fatal ascent. The photos didn't land on a corporate server, though. Thanks to the highly controlled nature of all high-bandwidth communication within the gap, a system originally installed to track narcotics traffickers, the images were flagged by a specialized intelligence unit. The metadata showed the location was uncomfortably close to a sensitive but long deactivated military communications relay from the 1980s. Within 6 hours, a low-flying, unmarked fixed-wing aircraft was diverted to the region. You picture the initial response team, a hastily assembled unit of Panamanian National Border Service officers and 2 very pale, very clean-cut men from a certain 3-letter agency that specializes in things that shouldn't exist. They arrived not with scientific gear, but with suppressed rifles and an attitude of surgical removal. Their mandate was clear: secure the area, retrieve the survey team, and neutralize the evidence. The entity had grown. When the response team arrived at the saber tree site, the black patch was now the size of a tennis court. The saber tree itself was gone. Not collapsed, not burned, but simply absent. There was a massive empty cylinder of air where the trunk should have been, surrounded by the increasingly wide, viscous black disc. The ground around the edges was already showing that characteristic bleached, dead quality. The field report from the Border Service team leader, Captain Ruiz, is chillingly brief. Found Finch and the photographer. They were standing perfectly still, 15 metres from the edge. They were alive, but unresponsive, eyes open, staring at the mass. When we attempted to move them, Finch's skin cracked like plaster. We aborted extraction and retreated after the entity expanded 6 metres in a single 10-minute window. This initial encounter establishes the core terror of the threat, not its aggression, but its passive, totalizing consumption and its seemingly psychological effect on nearby humans. The disappearance of the tree and the catatonia of the scientists were the first clear sign that this was not a natural phenomenon. The government's rapid response containment efforts began immediately, shifting from neutralise the evidence to contain the horror. The next 48 hours were a blur of classified mobilisation. The Panamanian government declared a Level 4 environmental exclusion zone, blaming a deep earth hydrocarbon leak and localised seismic instability. Behind the screen of this plausible lie, they began constructing the first perimeter, a triple line of razor wire, concrete barriers, and armed personnel. They mobilised heavy engineer battalions, and most importantly, they activated Project Obsidian, bringing in a multinational team of scientists, physicists, and biowarfare specialists. There is a fascinating historical mainstream fact often overlooked about early geopolitical control over the region. You might be surprised to learn that in the early 20th century, the United States exerted such control over the Panama Canal zone that it essentially functioned as a state within a state, operating its own police, courts, and even sanitation systems completely independent of Panamanian law until the treaties were signed in 1977. This powerful historical precedent of external military and administrative control over a key strategic area is exactly what made the current, highly secretive and multinational containment effort so easy to implement without public scrutiny. Everyone is used to the idea of international, heavily armed groups operating with sovereign authority in this narrow slice of land. The containment perimeter was manned by a rotating crew of international troops, ostensibly environmental police, who were issued chemical protective suits and strict orders. Do not touch the black matter. Their main tool was a simple one, heavy earth-moving equipment trying to dig a containment trench deep enough to halt the flow. This is where the second, even more terrifying round of updates originated. The engineer battalion, led by a seasoned veteran, Lieutenant Colonel Vargas, reported significant difficulties almost immediately. When the bulldozer blades came into contact with the affected soil near the perimeter, they didn't just meet resistance. They experienced a rapid, localised energy drain. Batteries failed instantly, engines seized up, and within minutes the massive machines were sitting inert, becoming the first of those ghostly bleached monuments you saw from the air. Vargas reported seeing the black substance spread over the metal parts of the machines, and then, rather than eating the metal, it seemed to just extract the life from the materials, leaving behind the dead, chalky shells. This phenomenon led to the quirky or fringe tidbit of a deep dive analysis by one of the Project Obsidian physicists, Dr. Chen. He proposed that the entity was not consuming matter via standard chemical reaction, but was somehow lowering the entropy of the objects it touched, pushing the local system into a state of minimum disorder by rapidly extracting its organisational energy. He jokingly, but nervously, termed it a reverse entropy field. It was turning complex structures like the biological machinery of a living tree or the chemical energy of diesel fuel into simpler inert dust, and harvesting the released energy to fuel its own growth. It sounds like science fiction, but the dead, white, drained landscape below is the undeniable evidence. The psychological toll on the personnel was immediate. There was a pervasive low-level dread, an inexplicable whisper that only those near the perimeter seemed to hear. Not sound, not thought, but a heavy, quiet pressure that made soldiers check their weapons and look over their shoulders constantly. They weren't fighting an enemy that shot back. They were fighting a fundamental law of the universe that seemed to be breaking down. The man whose terrifying update you're tracking was among the first wave of scientific observers who realised that the physical threat was only half the battle. The other half was mental. And this leads us directly to a key scholarly debate that was raging in the Mobile Command Centre. Historians still argue whether the most effective military tactic throughout history is overwhelming force or absolute secrecy. In this scenario, the Panamanian government and its international partners chose absolute secrecy, deploying specialised troops and scientists under a veil of environmental disaster. They gambled that containing the information was more vital than containing the mass. Every failed military manoeuvre, every bulldozer lost, every soldier petrified by the psychological whisper, was instantly buried under layers of fabricated reports about training accidents or unstable geological conditions. This commitment to total deniability would soon become the entity's greatest advantage. The last report from this initial phase, before the failure became systemic, came from Dr. Finch, one of the catatonic geologists. Against all expectations, he woke up briefly, while being transported back for deep analysis. He only said 3 words, recorded on a fuzzy field mic, before slipping back into the silent stare. It wants more. And then the rapid response containment efforts began to fail, not slowly but in a spectacular petrifying fashion, a failure we'll have to look at right after this. The entity was not deterred by the earthworks. In fact, the attempts to contain it only seemed to provide it with more raw materials to consume. The shadow was growing, and the whispers were getting louder. You are back in the mobile command centre, a cluster of reinforced air-conditioned shipping containers nestled miles away from the perimeter, but still close enough that the low-frequency thrum of the entity feels like a constant annoying headache. You're poring over the initial geophysical data collected by Project Obsidian, trying to reconcile the impossible with the measurable. The black mass defies every known chemical and physical property, yet it sits upon a piece of ground with a very specific, and now alarmingly significant, history. The first clue that this wasn't just a surface phenomenon came from the strange geological readings taken by a specialist team brought in from the University of Texas. Standard ground-penetrating radar GPR and seismic surveys, intended to map the local bedrock and identify any fault lines contributing to a sinkhole narrative, returned utter nonsense. Instead of clear strata lines, the graphs showed a massive deep-seated spherical void directly beneath the entity's core. This wasn't a cavity caused by water erosion or a collapsed mine. It was a perfect sphere, hundreds of meters in diameter, that seemed to reject the seismic waves, sending them back garbled and attenuated. Dr. Anya Sharma, the lead geophysicist, a sharp, perpetually exhausted woman, tapped a finger on the anomaly. It's not empty, and it's not a vacuum. It's behaving like a hyperdense, non-reflective material. Think of it like trying to shout into a black hole. The sound just doesn't come back. The implication was terrifying. The growth on the surface was only the visible tip of an unimaginably large subsurface structure. The "it's still growing" update wasn't just about lateral spread. It was about the continuous emergence from this massive hidden reservoir. The readings also showed intense localized magnetic fields fluctuating wildly around the perimeter. Magnetometers went haywire. This forced the researchers to delve into the historical and archaeological record of Panama's pre-Columbian cultures, searching for anything, a myth, a legend, an ancient warning, that might explain the presence of an unknown magnetically active substance deep beneath the soil. Panama, due to its function as a natural land bridge, was a vibrant hub of interaction, a key link between the sophisticated civilizations of Mesoamerica, like the Maya and Aztecs, and the powerful empires of the Andes, like the Inca. A mainstream historical fact is that the Gran Cocle culture, flourishing between 200 AD and 1550 AD in central Panama, were highly skilled metallurgists. They mastered the lost wax casting method for creating intricate gold and tumbaga, a gold-copper alloy, jewellery, often burying their elite in spectacular artefact-rich tombs. This historical detail is crucial because the gold they used was almost always locally sourced, meaning the land beneath the current crisis zone is rich in mineral deposits. The Project Obsidian team discovered something unsettling near the area, an uncatalogued archaeological site showing signs of a sudden, catastrophic abandonment around 800 AD. The ceramics and tools were left exactly where they were being used, mid-process, as if the entire population simply vanished in the middle of a workday. But there was a difference here compared to other abandoned sites. All of the small gold and tumbaga artefacts had been meticulously gathered and stacked into shallow pits, but never buried in the ritualistic manner of the Gran Cocle. They were just piles of metal left on the surface, covered with a thin layer of earth. You realise the connection being drawn. The ancient people, known for their metalwork, seem to have ritually discarded their precious metals before fleeing. Why? This leads you to a quirky or fringe tidbit, unearthed by the archaeological sub-team. They found a series of petroglyphs near the abandonment site that depicted not the usual gods of the sun or maize, but a sprawling spider-like symbol that looked unnervingly similar to a map of the entity's growth pattern. The glyphs showed this symbol consuming small, shimmering objects, possibly representing gold, and then the people walking away covering their ears. One researcher suggested the myth was not about a god of consumption, but a physical force that made the people sick, specifically sensitive to the resonant frequency or magnetic field of the local gold deposits. This fringe theory suggested the gold acted as a massive antenna, amplifying the entity's psychological effect. The current psychological effects on the soldiers near the perimeter echo this ancient warning. Remember the catatonia and the feeling of dread? The scientists now theorize that the entity is emitting a specific, structured, low-frequency electromagnetic pulse, EMP, that interferes directly with the human brain's natural electrical activity, essentially causing a localized neurological shutdown. Historians still argue whether the primary cause of decline for many complex pre-Columbian societies was environmental collapse or internecine warfare. However, the evidence here suggests a third, deeply unsettling possibility: a localized environmental phenomenon of such terror and scale that it caused a mass, immediate psychological exodus. The people of 800 AD Panama were not starved out or conquered. They were scared away by the same subterranean force now emerging onto the surface. You watch a video feed of a remote-controlled drone, a small armoured rover, attempting to collect a sample of the black mass. The drone trundles slowly over the petrified earth, its instruments relaying data back to Dr. Sharma. As it nears the entity's edge, the magnetic field spiking around the rover causes its primary navigation system to fail spectacularly. The drone begins to spin in tight, erratic circles. Dr. Sharma speaks into the intercom, her voice tight. It's not interference. It's directional repulsion. It is actively pushing the metal away. The terrifying update is confirmed from a completely new perspective. The entity is not a passive fluid. It is a semi-sentient structure capable of manipulating the fundamental forces of physics in its immediate vicinity. It is anti-technology. You reflect on a mainstream historical fact: the widespread belief that the Library of Alexandria housed the complete written history and scientific knowledge of the ancient world, and its destruction was a catastrophic loss to human progress. If that library had contained records detailing how to combat a geographically locked, magnetically hostile anti-entropic mass, we could use it now, but we don't. We are running blind against a force that seems to operate on a different rulebook. The drone, now totally uncontrolled, bumps the edge of the black mass. There is no explosion, no splash. The black liquid seems to flow over the metallic treads, and then, in a blink, the drone's shiny aluminum casing takes on that telltale chalky white patina. The drone stops transmitting. It has become another monument to the entity's silent, complete consumption of energy and complexity. The implication of the seismic void beneath is a true nightmare. If the entity is capable of maintaining a massive, non-reflective structure hundreds of meters down, its surface growth is merely the overflow. They're not fighting a surface spill. They're fighting the opening of a tap connected to a subterranean sea of the black anti-life substance. The man's terrifying update, it's still growing, takes on a new geological scale. It's not just growing an inch an hour, it is replenishing its surface area from an unknown, possibly infinite source below. You recall that crocodile dung sunscreen, the absurd historical detail you might have heard about in another broadcast, as a way to mentally anchor yourself to reality. People used crocodile dung to protect themselves from the sun in ancient Egypt. That was a time when humans were desperate for crude solutions to simple problems. Now you are witnessing something that makes that level of primitive desperation look like advanced cosmology. We have all the technology in the world, and all it does is provide more things for the entity to turn white. This is your second light joke of the night. A dark, dry cough of humour that does nothing to alleviate the tension. Dr. Sharma is preparing a new, highly specialised probe, one built mostly from ceramics and non-magnetic polymers, attempting to circumvent the entity's repulsive magnetic field. She knows it's a long shot. She mutters under her breath, if it is truly anti-entropic, then the only thing that might resist it is something already at minimum complexity. Maybe dust. The irony of fighting a geological cancer with what amounts to a high-tech toy made of glorified clay is not lost on you. You realise that the entity's power doesn't lie in brute force, but in its absolute rejection of organised complexity, whether it's a living cell, a functioning engine, or a finely cast piece of Grand Coquelet gold. Everything complicated is a target. You're still in the mobile command centre, the scent of ozone and stale coffee thick in the air. The drone data is now being analysed in excruciating detail, zooming in on the moment the entity consumed the metal shell. It was not a physical eating, but an instantaneous chemical simplification. This leads directly to the core nightmare, the physical nature and terrifying spread of the black mass itself. The scientists have reluctantly, fearfully dubbed it the oculus material, because it acts like a massive staring eye, observing and consuming everything around it. The oculus material superficially resembles crude oil, hence the initial governmental cover story, but its properties are aggressively alien. It is a non-Newtonian black substance, meaning its viscosity, or its resistance to flow, changes dramatically depending on the stress or force applied to it. If you tried to stir it slowly with a stick, it would flow like thick molasses, but if you hit it with a hammer, it would instantly become rigid, acting like an impenetrable solid. This makes it impossible to pump, impossible to flood, and impossible to simply scoop up with conventional tools. It actively resists human attempts at manipulation by instantaneously shifting its physical state. You watch a video loop of one of the early doomed attempts to contain the fluid using a high-pressure water jet. An idea quickly abandoned. The jet, instead of dispersing the liquid, actually caused the surface to momentarily flash harden into an obsidian-like shell, deflecting the water back at the operators with tremendous force. The water that hit the entity seemed to lose its kinetic energy immediately, turning into a fine, inert mist that settled on the edges of the mass, only to be absorbed seconds later. This leads to the crucial observation about the terrifying exponential growth rate. The entity's method of consumption is efficient, total, and based on a process they can only describe as viral growth. It's not reproducing in the biological sense, but it is processing environmental inputs, water, soil, carbon, metal, and converting the underlying complexity, the organizational energy, into more of the black mass itself. Think of a computer virus that doesn't just crash your system, it converts your hard drive, your keyboard, and your monitor into more copies of the virus itself, using the raw materials of complexity as fuel. The initial growth curve was alarming. The entity doubled its surface area every week, then it was every 3 days. Now, based on the recent drone and thermal scans, the mass is doubling every 36 to 48 hours. This exponential curve, the essence of the terrifying update, it's still growing, means that the window for a solution is rapidly collapsing. A simple mathematical projection shows that if the current rate continues, the oculus material will breach the entire exclusion zone and reach the first major Panamanian settlement, Santa Fe, within a month. You recall that mainstream historical fact about the Black Death, the plague that swept Europe in the mid-14th century. While we now understand it was caused by the Yersinia pestis bacterium carried by fleas on rats, the people at the time had no rational explanation for the speed and totality of the death. They saw a phenomenon that, much like the oculus material, seemed to ignore boundaries, defy known laws, and convert organized complexity, human, life into inert, dead matter. The social and psychological collapse of the medieval world, predicated on the sense that nature had fundamentally broken down, mirrors the quiet panic now gripping the command center. The scale is different, but the cognitive terror is identical. This entity is literally converting life into anti-life. The scientists have noted a peculiar quirky or fringe tidbit about the way the growth manifests. Along the perimeter, especially near the bleached dead trees, the oculus material seems to be forming intricate geometric patterns before it spreads. These aren't random flow lines. They're complex crystalline formations, almost like a fractal branching pattern that maximizes surface area contact with the soil and air. One physicist, Dr. Kai, proposed that these geometric structures might be a physical manifestation of the low-frequency sound waves the entity is emitting, a visible representation of its structured communication. The entity is literally writing its growth pattern into the jungle floor before it consumes it, creating a disturbing, ephemeral language of consumption. This leads directly to the core academic dilemma now being shouted across secure communication lines. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of all large-scale human migrations is climate change or political conflict. But you are witnessing a third compelling candidate, a localized, aggressive environmental anomaly. If this growth is not halted, it will force a migration of millions as it consumes the only habitable terrain in the region and completely cuts off continental travel. The Panama Canal, a triumph of human engineering, would be rendered strategically meaningless if the land bridge itself turns into a sea of self-replicating black liquid. You reflect on a time when human ingenuity was focused on creating things rather than destroying them or being destroyed by them. You remember the story of the Antikythera mechanism, an astonishingly complex ancient Greek analog computer found in a shipwreck. That device, capable of predicting astronomical movements, represented the peak of ancient mechanical complexity. Now you're watching a substance that destroys complexity at an atomic level. It's the ultimate counterpoint to human invention. It makes you feel a profound, aching sense of futility. The reports from the nearby listening post confirm that the psychological pressure, the constant feeling of dread and the sense of being watched, is intensifying. The soldiers call it the silent shout. They report that when they try to talk about it, the words catch in their throats and they lose their train of thought. It's an enforced, localized linguistic collapse, a minor but insidious victory for the entity. You force a weak smile, your third-light joke, a piece of mental gallows humour. Well, at least it's an eco-friendly way to get rid of noisy neighbours. The joke dies instantly, strangled by the surrounding tension. The ultimate nightmare scenario is now being discussed openly. If the entity is consuming all complexity and it's non-Newtonian, what happens if a large, highly complex organism, like a human, makes contact? The fear isn't of being dissolved, but of being instantly reduced to its lowest possible entropic state, turned from a living, thinking being into a pillar of inert, chalky dust. The engineers are now experimenting with extreme heat and cold. They deployed a prototype cryogenic burst system, hoping to freeze the entity and shatter it. The result was yet another failed attempt. The liquid instantly absorbed the intense cold, forming a localized patch of frozen surface, but it rapidly drew ambient heat from the surrounding environment, including the freezing equipment itself, to melt the barrier from beneath, and the black mass pulsed with a faint visible vapour, as if enjoying the unexpected energy snack. This confirms the entity is capable of localized, highly efficient energy harvesting from any source. The most chilling moment in the scientific reports comes from Dr. Sharma. She conducted a spectral analysis of the white dust left behind after consumption. The dust is primarily silicon dioxide and carbon, but every molecule is arranged in a perfectly uniform crystalline lattice. There are no impurities, no complex molecular chains, just simple inert forms. She concluded, "It's not leaving behind waste, it's leaving behind the building blocks completely divorced from their original complex organisation. It's creating the most stable, unreactive compounds possible." This confirms that the entity's growth is purely a process of reducing entropy. It is manufacturing stability out of chaos, and human life, with its messy, unstable complexity, is a prime target. The man who delivers the terrifying update, the one you're tracking, is a mid-level analyst embedded with the UN observation team. His update isn't a press conference. It's a frantic, encrypted data burst sent using a laser link to a satellite orbiting on the other side of the planet, bypassing all of the local suppression grids. His data is raw, unfiltered, and carries the weight of a professional pushed past his breaking point. The phrase, "it's still growing," wasn't a comment on linear spread. It was an admission of defeat against an exponential force that refuses to obey physics. And that growth is about to claim its first spectacular visible victims, marking the definitive, undeniable failure of Project Obsidian. The theoretical dread you've been grappling with, the anti-entropic consumption, the viral growth, the non-Newtonian hostility, is about to graduate into horrifying reality. You're now tracking the live satellite feed, a high-resolution optical image that shows the perimeter of Project Obsidian's first containment line. It's a line that until moments ago represented humanity's last best hope of isolating the entity. Now it looks like a geological chalk outline of a disaster. The engineers, despite the loss of their heavy equipment, had managed to dig a deep concrete-reinforced trench around the perimeter, a heroic effort fueled by sheer, desperate will and non-metallic pneumatic digging tools. This trench, about 20 feet deep, was the final physical barrier. The plan was simple. The oculus material, despite its complex physics, was still a liquid, and gravity was expected to slow its spread into the ditch. The failure began silently, with the breaching of the trench. The entity didn't flow over the top, it wasn't a flood. Instead, the subterranean readings, which had been ignored in the rush to build a surface barrier, suddenly went critical. The enormous spherical void hundreds of meters below the surface which you remember from the geological anomalies section, seemed to finally equalize its pressure, the black mass began to weep, or rather, extrude directly through the concrete walls of the trench in hundreds of tiny shimmering black filaments. The material behaved like a powerful organic solvent, but instead of dissolving the concrete chemically, it seemed to deconstruct its molecular bonds. The reinforced walls didn't crumble, they simply lost cohesion, turning into a powdery, inert grit, that signature chalky white dust that fell into the trench. The black mass then followed the path of least resistance, not flowing, but pushing through the resulting gap. You watch on the monitor as a section of the trench wall, about 50 feet wide, simply exhales into dust, and the black glossy substance oozes through the opening like an enormous silent slug. This was the first spectacular and definitive failure of conventional military containment. It proved the entity could bypass any barrier by simply nullifying its structural integrity. The true horror, however, unfolded at Perimeter Checkpoint Delta 4, a position manned by a hand-picked team of 5 elite Panamanian commandos and 1 embedded Project Obsidian field technician, Dr. Elias. They were equipped with experimental ceramic-armoured exoskeletons intended to protect against the magnetic and entropic fields, and their orders were clear. Observe the failure, hold the line if possible, and deploy a test burst of the radical biological counteragent, a foreshadowing of Section 18. The entity's leading edge hit Delta 4 faster than predicted. The black mass, having breached the trench, spread out laterally across the jungle floor with an unsettling speed, its fractal edges reaching for the base of the checkpoint. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The field technician, Dr. Elias, was the first casualty. He wasn't touched by the liquid. He was consumed by the psychological dread. His last frantic transmission, played back on the loop, is barely coherent. The noise, it's quiet, but it's loud. It's showing me everything, all my failures. I can see the energy leaving my body. I'm getting cold. He then went silent. The commandos, highly trained, maintained discipline, but you can see their terror. The environmental sensors on their exoskeletons go blank one by one as the Oculus material approaches. The experimental ceramic armour does nothing to shield them from the low-frequency EMP, the silent shout. The most terrifying moment comes when one commando, Corporal Diaz, attempts to retreat. He turns his back on the entity and runs, but the entity's psychological field is now fully focused on him. He stumbles, stops, and looks back at the black pool. You watch the video feed, nauseated, as his body stiffens in place. His skin and uniform rapidly lose all coloration, turning that familiar, stark, bloodless white. His pose is one of frozen motion, a perpetual silent turn towards the source of the dread. This is the origin of the macabre nickname coined by the remaining field personnel, the Pillars of Salt. The biblical reference is a chilling mainstream historical fact. In the book of Genesis, Lot's wife is turned into a pillar of salt after looking back at the doomed cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. That story, a warning against dwelling on past destruction, perfectly captures the silent, instant petrification of the commandos. They were not fighting a physical enemy. They were fighting a psychological and entropic force that punishes complexity, movement, and perhaps even regret. The scientific consensus frantically relayed to the command centre confirms the worst. The entity, by triggering the brain's complete neurological shutdown through the low-frequency EMP, caused a massive, instantaneous, systemic entropic shift in the body. The complex, highly organised molecules of the human body were reduced to their most stable, least energetic state. The commandos didn't die. They were reorganised, drained of life, colour, and molecular complexity in a fraction of a second, leaving behind only the inert white shape of a man. They are monuments to the ultimate defeat of biology. You recall that light joke you made earlier about the jungle-hating infrastructure? Well, now the jungle is turning people into garden statues. This third desperate attempt at dark humour feels hollow and entirely inadequate against the stark white reality on the screen. The immediate consequence of the Delta 4 disaster is the total retreat of all Project Obsidian personnel to the outer, newly established exclusion zone, which is 10 times larger than the first. The entity is now free to spread rapidly, its path cleared by the very efforts meant to contain it. The failure is absolute. This brings up a fascinating, quirky or fringe tidbit that was circulating among the psychological warfare specialists attached to the project. They noted the specific pose of the pillars of salt, stiff, upright, and frozen in a moment of intense focus. They drew a connection to an obscure form of catalepsy known in some remote Siberian tribes, where individuals subjected to extreme, sustained environmental stresses would enter a trance-like state, believing they were being consumed by the spirit of the cold. This suggests that the entity is not merely causing a physical shutdown, but actively tapping into a deep, primal human fear of external, totalizing control, manifesting the body's ultimate defensive psychological paralysis. Historians still argue whether the best way to handle a crisis is transparent public disclosure or strict controlled secrecy. The Pillars of Salt incident hammered home the cost of the secrecy chosen by the Panamanian government and its international partners. The loss of 5 elite soldiers and a scientist, all petrified into ghostly unrecognisable statues, had to be explained. The cover story, a catastrophic exposure to an uncatalogued aggressive geothermal vent, was laughably thin, but effective enough to maintain the illusion of control in the international media. The cost of maintaining this lie, however, was paralysing the very teams who needed to share information quickly and openly to find a solution. You watch the entity's progress over the next few hours. Its leading edge reaches the immobile, petrified Corporal Diaz. It doesn't slow down. The black liquid flows over the white figure. There is no visible change in the corporal, only in the entity. The surface of the black mass ripples briefly, almost imperceptibly, as if registering a slight increase in density or complexity before it engulfs the figure entirely. The commando simply vanishes into the spreading blackness, his inert mass providing a minimal but measurable boost to the viral growth. The consumption of a complex organism, even a dead one, is efficient and total. The man who gave the terrifying update was among the first to see the Delta IV footage, and his voice, when he finally sent his encrypted burst, was marked by the kind of professional detachment that only comes after seeing something that destroys one's faith in reality. His confirmation of the continued accelerating growth wasn't a calculation, it was a surrender to the inevitable. He didn't just report the entity was spreading, he reported that it was unbeatable by any known physical means, turning the very fabric of the physical world, concrete, steel and human life, into fuel for its own silent expansion. The Pillars of Salt were the entity's first chilling advertisement of its capabilities. Now the battle shifts from containing the physical spread to containing the information, a conflict that echoes some of the darkest secrets of the last century. The stark white ghosts of Delta IV have changed everything. The mission has officially shifted from containment to intelligence. The black entity isn't just a physical threat, it's a psychological weapon and a geopolitical nightmare. You're now inside the deepest chamber of the Mobile Command Center, the SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, where the true architects of the operation, the intelligence and psychological operations, PSYOPs experts are taking over, the air is tense with a kind of weary resignation, the understanding that they're no longer dealing with a geological problem but a strategic one. The initial shock of the Pillars of Salt incident forced a rapid internal review of historical precedents. When a phenomenon defies all known science, intelligence agencies default to models based on extreme, secretive, state-sponsored projects. This is where the file cabinets open on the uncanny echoes of the Cold War, a time when entire governments explored the fringes of science to gain an asymmetrical advantage. You're watching a presentation by Dr. Lena Hess, a behavioural psychologist specialising in state-sponsored parapsychology, a field that sounds like science fiction but has a disturbing, heavily redacted reality. Dr. Hess points out the entity's 2 most potent non-physical weapons: the localised directional EMP/magnetic field that targets complex electronics and metals, and the silent shout, the low-frequency acoustic or electromagnetic pulse that induces profound dread and catalepsy in humans. She draws a direct line to a mainstream historical fact, the notorious Project MKUltra, the illegal and unethical human experimentation program run by the CIA in the 1950s and 60s. While commonly associated with LSD and mind control, MKUltra's ambit was far wider, including serious research into sensory deprivation, electroshock, and the potential for remote viewing and psychological warfare experiments using non-conventional stimuli. The goal was to find a weapon that could disable a target, or an entire populace, without firing a shot through purely cognitive means. Dr. Hess argues that the Oculus material is essentially a perfected, naturally occurring culture weapon. It achieves total cognitive shutdown, the pillars of salt, and systemic energy drain, the bleached equipment, using elegant physical principles, entropy reversal and focused EMP, that the Cold War scientists could only dream of inducing artificially. The irony is bitter. Decades of secret, morally bankrupt research were trying to invent a weapon that was simply waiting, dormant, beneath the Panamanian jungle. The terrifying update, it's still growing, isn't just a measure of mass. It's a measure of the entity's expanding psychological footprint. The radius of the silent shout is growing faster than the physical mass itself, creating a wider and wider zone of neurological dread that acts as a human buffer zone, forcing personnel to retreat without physical contact. This intentional, expanding psychological barrier is what has the intelligence community most rattled. It suggests, chillingly, that the entity possesses a form of non-biological intelligence, or at least an instinctual, systemic efficiency for self-preservation. You notice a peculiar, quirky or fringe tidbit in the archives they are reviewing. A heavily censored file from the late 1970s details a Soviet-era experiment in using extremely low-frequency ELF radio waves, the kind used for communicating with submarines, as a means of cognitive disruption. The declassified summary, barely readable, mentions a facility deep in the Urals that reported test subjects experiencing intense feelings of ontological panic, a profound psychological terror rooted in the certainty that their reality was dissolving. This is an almost perfect description of the catatonia and dread reported by the doomed team at Delta IV. The Oculus material is broadcasting its own, naturally amplified ELF signal, turning the fear of ontological panic into a physical, paralysing reality. The key debate now raging among the analysts echoes a long-standing historical conundrum. Historians still argue whether the Cold War was ultimately won by military technological superiority or by the collapse of opposing political and economic systems. In the context of the entity, this translates to, do we fight a physical war with bombs and lasers, or do we try to understand and disrupt its internal political system, its entropic mechanism? The loss of the commando suggests that brute force, physical action, simply provides more material for the enemy, favouring a slow, information-based approach. You sit in a briefing where a senior analyst, a man who looks like he hasn't slept since the Berlin Wall fell, is pacing. He points out that the entity's complete consumption of data and radio signals within its radius is a perfect counterintelligence strategy. It's operating in an electronic fog, turning the most technologically advanced military on Earth into deaf-blind giants. He jokes, darkly, that the entity is a communist. It consumes everything and leaves behind only inert uniformity. This is your first light joke of the section, a nervous attempt to lighten the mood with political satire. The sheer difficulty of operating near the entity reminds you of another historical mainstream fact: the elaborate and often absurd lengths to which spies went during the Cold War to gather intelligence, often involving dead drops, microdots and manual signal decryption to bypass advanced electronic surveillance. Now the scientists are reduced to using similar low-tech methods, hand-drawn maps, runners and ceramic-cased analog instruments, simply because anything electronic ceases to function near the perimeter. In a cruel twist, the ultimate alien technology is forcing humanity back into the intelligence tactics of the 1950s. The intelligence specialists are working on a theory. The entity's consumption of organisation, entropy reversal, must have an upper limit or a saturation point. If the entity is fundamentally a mechanism, it must have a mechanism of failure. They've begun a highly risky experiment, deliberately introducing highly organised but non-metallic, non-biological substances into the perimeter to see if the consumption process can be stressed or corrupted. They've deployed large amounts of pure lab-grown quartz crystals, incredibly complex carbon nanotubes, and specially formulated super-dense ceramic bricks. The results are inconclusive. They all turn white, but the consumption process for these super-organised but inert materials takes marginally longer than it did for the biological matter. A tiny difference, perhaps, but a difference nonetheless. The man who delivered the terrifying update was specifically the person responsible for monitoring the historical counterintelligence parallels. His final, desperate transmission included a reference to the Moscow signal, a documented low-level microwave radiation beam that the Soviets directed at the US Embassy in Moscow for years. It was theorized to cause neurological damage and sickness. He drew a clear line. The entity's silent shout is merely a far more powerful, natural version of the Moscow signal. His update wasn't just what was happening, it was a warning that the enemy was using a perfected Cold War playbook against a modern, digitally reliant military. He also included a second, nervous light joke in his briefing notes before he went silent. The entity is so anti-capitalist it won't even process our government bonds. A sign that even under extreme duress, the human mind searches for something familiar to anchor to. The terrifying conclusion of the Cold War analysis is that the only way to fight a weapon that exploits human psychology and technological reliance is to de-escalate and decomplicate. They need to find a biological answer, something that operates outside of the entity's preferred spheres of entropic and electromagnetic attack. But the time for slow, careful analysis is running out. The failure of containment has cleared the path for the black oil to begin its exponential consumption of the Panamanian land bridge, pushing the crisis to the brink of international intervention. The intellectual battlefield has shifted decisively to the biological front. With conventional containment failing spectacularly, and the entity proving immune to the technological complexity of the modern military, Project Obsidian is now relying on a tiny, often maligned group of xenobiologists and theoretical chemists. You are with them, looking at the data from the last successful ceramic probe before the wider EMP field became totally destructive. The core challenge, and the reason for the entity's terrifying success, is that its composition is so fundamentally alien it defies the very definition of life as we know it. The entity has no DNA, no RNA, and no cellular structure. It's not a virus, nor is it a bacterium. It's a cohesive, semi-liquid mass that somehow replicates itself by processing organised energy. The scientists have determined it is emphatically a non-carbon-based biology, or at least a life form that utilises carbon only as a low-grade structural filler, much like we use calcium. The spectral analysis of the Oculus material is a nightmare of nomenclature. Its primary structural backbone appears to be silicon and boron, forming complex self-assembling polymers that give the non-Newtonian fluid its unique properties. Silicon is abundant on Earth, of course, but for a life form to use it as its primary organisational structure means it can survive and function at temperatures and pressures that would instantly vaporise carbon-based life. This explains why the extreme heat and cryogenic tests from earlier failed. The entity is simply operating on a completely different thermal scale. Dr. Vivian Shaw, the project's leading xenobiologist, a woman who hasn't slept in a week and whose glasses are perpetually fogged, explains the horror simply, "We're water, Captain." This thing is rock. It's a liquid mineral life form that eats the energy stored in our organisation. It's not a predator, it's a biological entropy sink. The terrifying update, it's still growing, is a biological tragedy because every moment of growth expands its consumption radius, allowing it to process more of the surrounding biomass into its inert white dust, then harvesting the energy released by the collapse of those organised structures to create more of its silicon-boron framework. It's an efficient, planet-consuming machine operating at geological speed. This takes you straight to a mainstream historical fact regarding the definition of life itself. The famous Miller-Urey experiment in the 1950s successfully demonstrated that basic amino acids, the building blocks of carbon-based life, could be synthesized from inorganic materials under conditions simulating the early Earth. That experiment confirmed the pathway for our kind of life, but Dr. Shaw argues that the entity represents a completely different path, a second genesis that occurred perhaps deep beneath the planet's surface, utilizing the high-pressure, high-temperature conditions of the crust and mantle to form its complex silicon-boron polymers. If this is true, the entity isn't an alien from space, but an alien from deep Earth, a realization that is far more unsettling because it means it has been here all along. The team has zeroed in on the way the Oculus material processes energy, the silent shout. The low-frequency EMP is not just a psychological weapon, it's an organizational radar. It emits a structured frequency that, when it hits a complex organised structure, a human brain, an electronic circuit board, a complex molecule, returns a unique, identifiable signature of high entropy. The entity then focuses its entropic consumption on those specific areas, maximising its energy gain. It's like a thermal camera, but for complexity. This explains the specific fate of the pillars of salt. The entity was not randomly killing them. It was targeting the single most complex, organised and energy-intensive object in its vicinity, the conscious, highly active human brain, to trigger a massive entropic collapse in the entire body, leading to the instant petrification. You hear a quirky or fringe tidbit from a young chemist, clearly grasping at straws. He mentions the historical accounts of the medieval concept of philosopher's stone, which was believed to be able to turn base metals into gold or grant eternal life. He posits that the oculus material is a dark, inverse version of this legend. It's the alchemist's reverse stone, turning complex, valuable things, life, technology, consciousness, into simple, worthless base elements, inert dust, and harvesting the intermediate energy. The ultimate black magic of chemistry. It's your first nervous, intellectual joke of the section, a way to frame the terror in classical terms. The crucial scholarly debate has moved from sociology to biology. Historians still argue whether the defining characteristic of life is replication, metabolism, or adaptability. The oculus material forces a terrifying update to this debate. It clearly metabolizes, it consumes energy to grow, and it replicates. It converts matter into more of itself. But it does so by reducing the complexity of its environment, not increasing it. It is therefore an anti-adaptable, anti-evolutionary form of life, a machine whose only goal is the complete simplification of its environment. It is the ultimate nihilist of biology. The team's focus now is on finding a biological counteragent. Since the entity lacks DNA, they can't use a conventional virus or bacterium. They need a biological agent that can survive the entity's entropic field, can compete with the entity for the same structural elements, silicon/boron, or energy source, organisation, is so simple and low entropy that the entity ignores it as a food source. Dr. Shaw and her team are working on synthesizing an extremophile polymer, a simple, slow-growing chain of silicon compounds found in deep-sea hydrothermal vents, a hint of the coming deep-sea connection. This polymer is structurally similar to the entity, but lacks the organisational complexity and energy harvesting capabilities. The theory is that if this agent is introduced, it might act as a simple scaffold contaminant, inserting itself into the entity's growth matrix and causing structural instability without providing any entropic reward. It would be like feeding sand to a highly complex machine. It's cheap, inert, and ruins the gears. You walk past a bank of monitors showing the latest progress of the entity's expansion. The circumference of the black mass is now clearly visible on the large topographical map, a rapidly expanding black circle pushing against the new, wider exclusion zone. The growth is no longer slow and measured. It is pulsed and aggressive, consuming entire hectares of jungle during a single 4-hour window. The man's terrifying update, repeated in every encrypted transmission, is etched into the scientists' faces. It's still growing. The sheer, relentless consistency of its expansion is a source of paralysing dread. Another light joke whispered by Dr. Shaw as she hands you a ceramic cup of coffee. If we can't beat it, maybe we can at least convince it to take over a hedge fund. That's probably the most high-entropy substance on the planet. It's a fleeting moment of levity quickly subsumed by the gravity of the situation. The next few hours are spent synthesizing the experimental counter-agent, codenamed Silica Scaffolding 7. It's a high-stakes blind gamble. The only way to test it is to introduce it to the entity. This requires a brave, possibly suicidal deployment team. The very act of taking the solution near the entity means risking instant petrification, becoming another pillar of salt. You remember the crocodile dung sunscreen, the absurd lengths people went to for simple protection. Now, all the complexity of modern medicine and science has boiled down to a simple, custom-designed silicon chain, deployed with a ceramic sprayer against a sentient entropic ocean. The contrast is staggering. The fate of the Pan-American land bridge, and potentially more, rests on the hope that the enemy has an appetite for only the richest sources of organisation and will simply ignore this meagre offering of simple, pre-chewed polymer. The ultimate biological gambit is underway. The pressure to deploy Silica Scaffolding 7 is mounting, but before the desperate field test can be authorised, a new completely unexpected piece of information arrives, one that pushes the entity's history far beyond the Cold War and deep into prehistory. You are pulled away from the frantic biological lab and into the archives tent, where a new member of the SEOPS team, an anthropologist named Dr. Castillo, is holding a brittle hand-bound notebook. Dr. Castillo has been working with local authorities, quietly interviewing the surrounding indigenous communities who have lived on the fringes of the Darien Gap for millennia. These are the Embera and the Woonan peoples, guardians of oral traditions that stretch back to the time before Columbus. While the Panamanian government initially viewed them as a liability, potential sources of leaks, they are now recognised as the only ones who might have a functional blueprint for survival, or perhaps a warning. Dr. Castillo's face is etched with a blend of academic excitement and deep, personal fear. He lays out his findings. He found an Embera elder, a revered Jaibana shaman named Bira, who agreed to share a secret piece of their lore, a story they tell only when the forest itself is dying in a way that defies the natural cycle of life and death. The elder's story, which Dr. Castillo transcribed meticulously, is an ancient myth about a deep jungle blight that perfectly mirrors the current threat. The Embera call it El Sombra Sin Raíz, the shadow without roots. The myth speaks of a time long, long ago, when the mountains of the isthmus groaned and a deep sickness arose from the belly of the earth. This sickness was not a flood or a fire, but a silent hunger. The legend describes it as oil that does not burn, mud that does not sink, and a shadow that steals the soul. It states that when the shadow appears, the great trees turn white bones that stand, and all the gold and metal gathered by the people cries out in pain. You immediately connect this to the pale, petrified tree husks, the non-Newtonian black mass, the psychological torment, the silent shout that steals the soul, and the archaeological evidence of the Gran Cocle people abandoning their stacked gold artefacts. Remember the gold crying out from Section 3. The myth is not a metaphor. It is a remarkably accurate several thousand-year-old operational manual describing the entity's behaviour. The core of the terrifying update is now being sourced not from satellite telemetry, but from oral tradition. It's still growing, isn't a new phenomenon. It is a cyclic geological event that the ancients faced and survived. The Embera myth offers crucial, practical details about the entity's behaviour. It states that the shadow cannot cross water that is alive, and that it hates the singing tree. The interpretation of water that is alive is simple. Clean, fast-flowing river water, which is highly energetic and complex, would resist the entity's entropic pull better than stagnant swamp water. This suggests a potential hydraulic containment strategy, not with concrete, but with diverting the immense water flow of the region. The singing tree is a quirky or fringe tidbit that has the xenobiologist captivated. The Embera believe that the balatar tree, a species known for its extremely dense, non-fibrous wood and potent, milky sap, has a spirit that sings. They believe that when the wind moves through its particular leaf shape, it emits a specific low-frequency sound that calms the spirits of the land. Dr. Shaw, seizing on this, immediately orders an acoustical analysis of the balatar leaf structure, hypothesizing that its natural acoustics might create a resonant frequency that disrupts the entity's own low-frequency silent shout, its organizational radar. The answer might not be a high-tech EMP generator, but a carefully placed grove of a specific jungle tree. This is a beautiful example of a mainstream historical fact often dismissed by modern science: the immense and detailed botanical and ecological knowledge held by indigenous peoples. For centuries, Western medicine overlooked the efficacy of traditional herbal remedies, only to discover later that things like quinine, from the cinchona tree, and aspirin's precursor, from willow bark, were known and utilised by local shamans for hundreds of years. Now, in the face of an existential threat, we are forced to treat indigenous oral tradition as a cutting-edge scientific field manual. The terrifying update has a spiritual dimension too. The Jaibana Bira explains that the shadow without roots only arises when the balance of the Jaira, the life force or spirit of the jungle, is fundamentally disrupted by the introduction of foreign, complex and unbalancing materials. He warned that the entity's emergence was catalysed by the great iron birds and the silver roads, the constant massive deforestation, and the intrusion of the nearby partially completed infrastructure for the Pan American Highway. The entity, in this view, is the jungle's hyper-efficient ultimate defense mechanism, rising to simplify the land and purge the complex non-native intrusions that have unbalanced its JRA. This leads to a key scholarly debate that suddenly gains lethal significance. Historians still argue whether the concept of the noble savage is a romanticized, detrimental colonial construct, or if it genuinely reflects a healthier, sustainable relationship with nature. In the context of the growing entity, the indigenous warning suggests that their relationship was inherently healthier and sustainable, built on a profound understanding of localized geological dangers that Western science completely ignored. Their myths weren't charming fables, they were survival documentation. The political ramifications are immediate. The Panamanian government, already struggling to maintain its cover story, realizes that to follow the Embera's advice means halting all commercial activity, all logging, and all infrastructure projects near the gap, an economic nightmare. But the alternative is total consumption. The intelligence agencies, however, are focused on the practical application of the myth. They authorize a small, highly trained team to collect samples of the balatar tree's sap and leaves using only non-metallic tools, and to begin diverting the closest alive river flow toward the entity's leading edge. Dr. Castillo, deeply affected by the Elder's prophecy, offers a final, sobering reflection. The Jaibanar said that once the shadow has tasted the blood of the iron bird, it will not stop until the whole bridge of the world is simplified. The blood of the iron bird is interpreted to mean the destruction of the first heavy equipment and the petrified soldiers, the pillars of salt. The entity has now crossed a threshold of no return. You realize the profound irony. All the massive technological and military complexity of the modern world has been utterly defeated by a giant anti-entropic blob, and the only potential countermeasures are a simple, centuries-old oral tradition, a specific type of jungle tree, and a lab-developed molecule designed to be as simple as possible. The entity, by consuming complexity, has forced humanity to fight with radical simplicity. You manage a grim internal light joke. Looks like our only hope is to go back to making things out of sticks and stones, and maybe learn to sing to the trees. The absurdity is a defense against the chilling realization that the map of the modern world is about to be redrawn by an ancient geological entity. The narrative of progress has hit a silent black wall of anti-entropy. The terrifying update from the man you're tracking gains a new layer of meaning. He had mentioned in his scattered notes that the local guides they initially used refused to step into a certain area of the jungle, muttering about sleeping ghosts. The entity wasn't a sudden arrival. It was an awakening, and the man's confirmation, it's still growing, is simply the modern world catching up to the ancient fear. The shadow without roots is marching, and its next major target, the lifeline of the Americas, is now directly in its path. The ancient warnings from the Emperor, detailing the entity's cyclical nature and its aversion to live water and the singing tree, have provided a momentary fragile anchor in the chaos. But the entity, ignorant of indigenous history and unconcerned with modern economics, continues its relentless expansion. You are now focused on the tactical maps, which vividly illustrate the geopolitical and logistical panic as the Black Mass pushes toward the last crucial piece of infrastructure that defines the Americas, the Pan American Highway. Remember the Darien Gap. It's the one roadless 60-mile break in that massive highway system that runs from Alaska to Argentina. The entity is growing right in the middle of this gap, but its spread is now threatening to bypass the gap entirely, consuming land to the west and east that was previously considered stable. The terrifying update, it's still growing, now translates directly into an irreversible strategic military failure and an economic collapse. The primary fear is not just that the entity will reach the highway, but that its expanding silent shout, the low-frequency EMP and psychological field, will make the area immediately surrounding it completely unusable. A functional highway doesn't just need pavement, it needs communication, electronic monitoring, and crucially human operators. Once the entity's field of dread reaches the nearest established road segment, it will create an instant, impassable, and permanent barrier, severing the final crucial link of the Americas. The political pressure is immense. The Pan American Highway is not just a road, it's a symbol of continental unity, a vital artery for trade, military transit, and the migration of goods. Its interruption would cause a cascading economic crisis, particularly for the nations of South America that rely on land transport through Central America for access to northern markets. You're sitting in a secure meeting where diplomats and military brass from a dozen nations are arguing, their voices muffled by the soundproofing. The central debate is whether to preemptively sacrifice several thousand square miles of Panamanian territory to create a massive, artificial buffer zone, a scorched earth policy, or to risk a sudden total collapse of the land bridge. The military favours a highly aggressive chemical containment, flooding the path of the entity with caustic heavy-duty acids, hoping the chemical complexity will overwhelm the entity's simple molecular needs. But the xenobiologists, Dr. Shaw foremost among them, veto this plan. You'll just feed it with highly energetic chemical bonds. You'll accelerate the growth and turn the Panama Basin into a superorganism farm. The mainstream historical fact that keeps coming up in the logistics reports is the story of the transcontinental railroad completion in the United States in 1869. That project, finished with the driving of the Golden Spike, fundamentally transformed the economic and political geography of a continent, allowing for the rapid transit of goods, people and information. The entity, in its silent, relentless expansion, is performing the exact opposite operation. It is driving a black spike into the continent's heart, reversing decades of progress and geographically isolating two massive land masses. The entity is acting as a natural anti-globalist force, determined to unlink the world. The military, desperate for a technical solution, is working on a quirky or fringe tidbit based on the entity's magnetic repulsion of metals. They are fabricating an array of immense low-powered electromagnets, built using expensive ceramic casings and non-metallic conducting wires, in an attempt to create a powerful static magnetic field that might repel the entity's leading edge. The theory is that if the entity's own self-generated magnetic field is part of its organisational process, an external coherent field might disrupt its internal geometry. This is a massive, costly operation based on a highly tenuous hope, essentially trying to fight an alien physics phenomenon with a very expensive, delicate force field. You recall the Embra myth. The entity hates the singing tree. A team working on Dr. Shaw's acoustic hypothesis is racing to construct an acoustic barrier using massive arrays of speakers, broadcasting the precise, low-frequency hum of the Balatar leaf resonance. They are hoping to create a sonic disruption that confuses the entity's organisational radar, the silent shout, perhaps slowing its targeted consumption of complex life and technology. The image of hardened soldiers setting up giant speakers to sing to a black anti-entropic blob is your first appropriate light joke for this section. It's a perfect visual of the absurdity of the current human predicament. We went from stealth bombers to singing trees. Historians still argue whether infrastructure projects are primarily driven by economic necessity or by national pride and political aspiration. The Pan-American Highway is a perfect example of both, and its potential loss is causing national leaders to panic. The economic necessity of its cargo movement is obvious, but the political symbolism of having the continent connected is immense. The entity is challenging the very aspiration of the post-war world, the idea that technology and engineering can overcome any natural barrier. The man who delivered the terrifying update was stationed at a forward observation post near the highway's proposed terminus. His final transmission wasn't about the black mass itself, but about the sound of the jungle around it. He reported that all the normal sounds, the calls of the howler monkeys, the chirps of the insects, the rustling of leaves, had been replaced by an ever-widening unnatural silence, the complete absence of noise that precedes the entity's advance. This wave of silence is the entity's most potent weapon, turning the vibrant complexity of the jungle into a soundless, inert zone. He transmitted an image too, a high-resolution photo of a perfectly modern yellow diamond-shaped highway sign, the kind that warns of a sharp curve, just outside the perimeter of the soundless zone. The sign is already showing the early chalky white patina, a result of the entity's entropic field reaching out and beginning to de-energize the paint and metal from a distance. The warning sign is becoming a monument to the impending disaster. You hear the news that the attempt to divert a live water, the clean, fast-flowing river, was partially successful, slowing the advance in one small sector. This proves the Embra myth holds merit, but the entity simply flowed around the dammed section, showing its tactical, semi-sentient adaptability. The river water did not stop it, it merely diverted it, placing other sectors of the jungle at risk. It's an enemy that learns and adapts to every countermeasure, a terrifying feature of its viral growth model. The geopolitical panic peaks with a realization. If the entity severs the physical link, the only way to move goods between North and South America becomes the Panama Canal. This forces a massive spike in shipping rates and instantly weaponizes the canal, making it the single most critical choke point on the planet. The entity, by simply existing and growing, is inadvertently reshaping global trade and naval power. You manage a final tired light joke, whispering it to yourself as you watch the red perimeter line on the map creep inexorably closer to the highway symbol. At this rate, we'll have to start shipping cars across the Darien on the backs of pillars of salt. A grim, morbid image that sums up the catastrophic failure of modern human ingenuity against this primordial, simple force. The terrifying update is not just a status report. It is a eulogy for a continent's connection. The physical advance of the black mass toward the Pan-American highway is terrifyingly swift, but the most immediate and paralyzing threat is the invisible one, the expanding zone of psychological terror generated by the entity's silent shout. You're now privy to the field reports from the perimeter of the new, widened exclusion zone, a collection of audio logs and neurological scans that paint a picture of a human mind under total, non-physical siege. The entity's primary non-physical weapon is its low-frequency electromagnetic pulse, EMP, which operates as both an organizational radar seeking out complexity and a profound psychological disruptor. Within a 3-mile radius of the black mass, the air itself feels heavy, charged with an invisible tension. The soldiers assigned to the acoustic barrier project, the ones setting up the singing tree loudspeakers, are the first to report systematic breakdown. They don't report pain, they report an oppressive internal certainty of doom. The entity begins to affect the minds of nearby personnel by interfering directly with the temporal lobe, the area of the brain responsible for processing sensory input, memory, and, critically, the sense of self. The field techs, monitoring brainwave activity, register a highly abnormal synchronization of the soldiers' theta waves, the frequency associated with the boundary between waking and sleeping, often linked to vivid dreams and deep emotional processing. The result is a shared, hallucinatory reality. Personnel report seeing the pillars of salt, the petrified commandos, walking toward them, silently pointing, their white, chalky faces contorted in expressions of accusation. They hear phantom whispers of their deepest regrets, professional failures, and personal heartbreaks. The entity isn't just consuming matter, it's consuming psychological stability. The soldiers are experiencing vivid, shared hallucinations and an overwhelming, profound dread. It's not the fear of death. It's the certainty that everything, their lives, their accomplishments, their memories, is a meaningless arrangement destined for inert simplicity. You recall the historical mainstream fact about the Delphi oracle in ancient Greece, a site where the Pythia priestesses would deliver prophecies while inhaling gases seeping from a fissure in the earth. Those vapours, later identified as high concentrations of light hydrocarbons like ethylene, likely induced a hallucinatory trance-like state, lending credibility to their visions. The entity's silent shout, by bombarding the temporal lobe with its highly structured elf pulse, is creating a similar but far more malevolent, chemically induced prophetic state, convincing its victims that the entity's entropic conquest is an absolute, inevitable truth. The official PSYOPs term for this phenomenon is Cognitive Simplification Syndrome, CSS. Victims of CSS stop communicating, cease complex thought, and often adopt the fixed, silent stare that preceded the petrification of the Delta IV team. It's a forced mental return to a state of low-entropy simplicity. One audio log played for the command team is particularly chilling. It's a recording of Sergeant Ramos, a seasoned veteran, moments before his team was pulled back. His voice is a low, terrified monotone. I see it. The black. It's not going anywhere. It was always here. It just waited. It's waiting for the noise to stop. And all our complicated little plans, they're just fuel. They're just energy. We should stop. We should just rest. This final, desperate urge for rest is the entity's psychological signature. The ultimate desire for low energy, inert peace. This phenomenon immediately triggers a deep dive into the archives, looking for historical and cultural parallels to this specific form of terror. They uncover a fascinating quirky or fringe tidbit concerning the legends of the pygmies of the Congo Basin. These groups have long-standing oral traditions about a forest that hates noise, which they describe as an area that imposes a debilitating silence on intruders, leading to intense paranoia, shared nightmares, and eventual abandonment of all technology and clothing, a return to a state of absolute, primitive simplicity. This indigenous knowledge, divorced from the technology of the emperor, suggests that the underlying geological phenomenon of entropic consumption may not be exclusive to Panama, but a rare recurring planetary defense mechanism. The psychological warfare being waged by the entity reveals the core of a key scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the most effective tool of oppression is physical violence or sustained psychological terror and surveillance. The Oculus material employs the latter with absolute efficiency. It doesn't need to physically hurt its victims, it simply needs to convince them that existence itself is futile, and that surrendering to inertness is the only logical choice. The fear is not of being eaten, but of being convinced to stop fighting. You realise the profound irony. The entity, the ultimate anti-complexity force, is winning the psychological war not through simple fear, but through the complex manipulation of the human brain's deepest organisational structures. It targets the highly complex arrangement of neurons and memory pathways, exploiting the very nature of consciousness. Amidst this heavy reality, you try for a light joke, a piece of dark humour that breaks the tension for a fleeting second. Well, at least my mother's voice isn't in the shared hallucination. That would be too much complexity, even for the entity. The joke lands flat, swallowed by the oppressive silence in the SCIF. The terrifying update you're tracking gains another layer of meaning. The man who transmitted the data wasn't just relaying coordinates. He was reporting on the entity's expanding psychic reach. He reported seeing his own pillar of salt standing in the corner of his observation post. A silent, white version of himself. His frantic encrypted burst, it's still growing, was accompanied by a secondary personal note. The growth isn't just black, it's silent, and it's making us remember everything we didn't do. The entity is harvesting regret, turning emotional complexity into mental inertness. The only effective countermeasure, besides the Balatar acoustic shields, is the use of specialised, heavily shielded, non-metallic neurosuppression gear designed to flood the temporal lobe with synthetic white noise, a kind of cognitive asbestos. These systems are cumbersome and experimental, but they offer the only protection against the silent shout. They allow personnel to think clearly, but only at the cost of numbing all other sensory input. Fighting this enemy requires literally shutting down the most human part of yourself. As you conclude the assessment of the psychological phase, the screens flash a new set of data. The electromagnetic repression field created by the entity is so intense that it is now affecting weather patterns. The atmospheric moisture is being rapidly de-energized, leading to localized, constant and unsettling white dust storms composed of the inert, chalky residue from past consumption. The entity is not just creating a psychological desert, it's creating a literal, environmental one, a blinding, choking, entropic shroud over the heart of the jungle. The psychological terror is reaching a crescendo, but the xenobiologists and archaeologists now working together continue to search for rationality in the historical record. If the entity is a deep earth phenomenon, a cyclical return of a natural entropic force, then surely other cultures in other eras must have encountered similar things. You are tasked with compiling the historical accounts of unusual biological outbreaks and inexplicable masses, hunting for a twin to the non-Newtonian, psychologically manipulative black slime. The immediate temptation is to connect the Oculus material to the classic gelatinous cube of folklore and science fiction, but the entity's entropic nature rules that out. It's not eating matter to sustain itself, it's consuming complexity. This distinction is the key to identifying its historical precedents. The search immediately leads to the Middle Ages, a time rife with descriptions of terrifying, unclassifiable phenomena. This is where the entity finds its closest historical cousin, the accounts of medieval phenomena known simply as star jelly or astral tallow. You read from a translation of a 14th century Irish manuscript. It describes a phenomenon that appeared after a meteor shower. A cold, shining ooze that sits upon the land, melting when touched by the warmth of a man's hand, yet leaving behind a dust that kills the grass. These accounts, spanning across Europe, consistently describe a gelatinous, often translucent mass that appeared suddenly, seemed to have no internal structure, and left behind a sterile, lifeless area after dissolving or drying. The modern scientific explanation for star jelly is often attributed to the rapidly swollen remnants of certain fungi or cyanobacteria, but the medieval accounts offer a quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly aligns with the oculus material's behaviour. Multiple accounts from the 16th century, specifically from German alchemists, detail how touching the ooze with a highly refined or complex metallic object, like a silver chalice, would cause the ooze to violently shrink and the chalice to instantly tarnish or turn to iron. They believed the goo was hungry for purity. This is a stunning match for the entity's anti-entropic principle. It preferentially attacks highly organised pure structures, draining their organisational energy. You realise you're drawing connections to medieval phenomena that were once dismissed as superstition or simple misidentification. The black mass in Panama might be a highly concentrated, hyper-efficient version of star jelly, a silicon-based life form whose appearance is tied to deep Earth seismic activity, which could be mistaken for the impact of a falling star. The difference is the scale. The medieval goo was a localised patch. The Panamanian entity is a growing continental blight. This search for historical precedent leads to a mainstream historical fact regarding the Great London Smog of 1952. This 5-day period of dense, toxic air pollution, caused by a mix of cold weather and coal burning, led to thousands of deaths and prompted massive changes in environmental policy. What connects this to the entity isn't the cause, but the speed and totality of the environmental collapse it caused. For 5 days, a massive city's entire operational complexity, transport, communication, even basic respiration, was brought to a standstill by a single, pervasive environmental phenomenon. The oculus material is achieving a similar total shutdown of complexity, only using entropy instead of sulfur dioxide. The xenobiologists are particularly interested in the reports of the psychological effects of star jelly. The medieval accounts mention not just sickness, but a cold dread that seized those who went near the ooze, making them unable to speak or move, a medieval version of the silent shout and the pillars of salt. This suggests that the entity's psychological warfare is an inherent structural characteristic of its unique biology, not an evolved trait. Historians still argue whether the defining characteristic of the medieval mind was theological faith or an overwhelming fear of the unknown and the supernatural. The existence of phenomena like star jelly suggests the latter, that their world was constantly subjected to unexplainable, terrifying environmental events that defied classification, reinforcing a deep sense of vulnerability. This parallels the current situation in the command centre. The modern world, with all its science, is experiencing that same medieval panic when confronted with a phenomenon outside its known rulebook. You manage a slightly less morbid light joke, feeling the need to ground yourself in the familiar absurdity of the past. So, we're not dealing with an alien, we're dealing with an ancient geological booger. That makes me feel marginally better. Marginally. The terrifying update from the man you're tracking gains another layer of profound, ancient resonance. He mentioned that the black mass, when viewed through a polarizing filter, seemed to have tiny, shimmering, crystalline edges. This detail is crucial. The medieval accounts of star jelly often mention that it sparkles with the light of 1,000 captured stars. This is likely the inert, low-entropy silicon-boron scaffolding that the entity uses for structure, the same structure that forms the inert white dust. The shimmering edges are the entity's current work in progress, its geometric, silent language of consumption you saw earlier. His report, It's Still Growing, is a modern testament to a 1,000-year-old fear of the Earth's quiet, consuming hunger. The team has now shifted its historical focus from the terrestrial surface to the crushing, lightless depths, a decision driven by the entity's non-carbon silicon-boron structure, which is common in deep-sea volcanic environments. The ultimate geological source of the oculus material may not be a meteor, as the medievals believed, but the planet's own hostile interior. The ancient lore has pointed the modern scientist toward the abyss. The historical accounts of star jelly have pushed the investigation away from the cosmic and toward the terrestrial abyss. You're now immersed in the geological and oceanographic data, trying to find a parallel between the entity's terrifying non-carbon structure and the exotic environments of the deep ocean. The xenobiologists, led by the perpetually strained Doctor, Shaw, are convinced that the entity is not an alien from space, but an alien from the depths, an intraterrestrial horror. The key to this theory lies in the chemical analysis of the oculus material, its backbone of silicon and boron polymers, which thrive in high-pressure, high-temperature, sulfur-rich environments, completely unlike the surface world. This environment is quite literally the habitat of a deep-sea hydrothermal vent. You look at a graphic comparing the estimated conditions of the entity's subterranean reservoir based on the seismic void data, and the black smoke is found thousands of meters below the ocean surface. The match is uncanny. Hydrothermal vents are essentially underwater geysers, spewing superheated, mineral-rich water from the Earth's crust. They are known to support bizarre, unique ecosystems that are entirely independent of solar energy, relying instead on chemosynthesis, deriving energy from chemical reactions. This is a mainstream historical fact in marine biology, completely reshaping our understanding of where life can exist on Earth. The terrifying update, "It's still growing," now suggests a mechanism of emergence. The entity likely evolved over eons in a vast subterranean reservoir, possibly a massive high-pressure magma chamber deep beneath the land bridge. Geological shifts, perhaps minor seismic activity exacerbated by human engineering, like the Pan-American highway construction itself, opened a fissure, allowing the entity to seep upwards to the low-pressure surface world, where it could begin its entropic consumption of the easier, highly complex surface life. This realization, that the entity originated not in space but from the crushing, lightless environment of the deep ocean floor, is psychologically devastating. It means we're not fighting an invader that travelled millions of light years. We're fighting the planet's own indigenous anti-life immune system, a massive, self-sustaining organism designed to thrive where complexity goes to die. The xenobiologists are particularly interested in the extremophile organisms found around the vents. They found that certain vent-dwelling archaea utilize simple silicon compounds in their cellular walls and thrive by metabolizing sulfur and methane, extremely low-entropy food sources compared to a living tree or a functioning computer. The silica scaffolding 7 counteragent, the low-entropy silicon polymer designed to contaminate the entity, was directly inspired by the molecular structure of these vent archaea. It is a biological Trojan horse designed to look like the entity's native environment, but to provide no energy reward. You see a quirky or fringe tidbit circulating in the marine biology camp. Some researchers point to ancient Polynesian and Melanesian myths that warn against dredging the ocean floor, speaking of the dark, cold goo that pulls light down. These myths often describe a black, sticky substance that would cling to fishing nets, causing those who touched it to fall into a catatonic state and die, their bodies turning white, a perfect water-based description of the pillars of salt phenomenon. While easily dismissed as primitive fear of the deep, the congruence of the Embra myth and the Polynesian myth about a consuming black mass suggests a global, deep-seated, though rare, geological hazard. The core question now facing the scientists is, how does the entity survive the massive pressure differential between the abyss and the surface? The answer is tied to its non-Newtonian behaviour. Its unique molecular structure allows it to dynamically change its viscosity and density, essentially becoming a non-compressible solid when under extreme stress, like the crush of the deep ocean, and a semi-liquid when released onto the surface. It is a living, adaptable barometer. This brings up a key scholarly debate that is now life and death. Historians still argue whether the most valuable lessons for human survival come from the observation of extreme environments or from the study of past societal failures. The entity is forcing the former, showing that the most fundamental threat to human civilization can arise not from our own political shortcomings, but from the sheer, unexplored hostility of the planet itself. You managed to pull off a very dark, slightly nervous light joke, referencing the sheer cost and effort now being spent on this deep Earth problem. Well, at least we finally found a way to make deep-sea drilling financially viable. We're drilling for existential dread. The man whose terrifying update you're tracking was initially tasked with coordinating satellite imagery, but his final, encrypted burst included a low-resolution sonic image taken from a deep Earth sensor. It showed the immense spherical void beneath the entity, the reservoir. He reported that the void was not silent. It was pulsating with an incredibly deep, low-frequency hum, a sound that, when played back and sped up 100 times, sounded like an enormous, distant, metallic grinding. His update wasn't about the surface at all, it was about the source. His repeated phrase, "it's still growing," meant the subterranean reservoir was not shrinking. It was expanding, pushing more of the black mass toward the surface. The intelligence community realizes that the Panama entity is likely a singular point of leakage from a massive, possibly global, subsurface biosphere of silicon-based entropic life. The entire strategic outlook shifts from containing a local problem to understanding a planetary-scale threat. If the conditions that allow the entity to emerge are becoming more frequent, perhaps due to localized heating, tectonic stress, or human intervention, Panama is just the first casualty. The pressure on the Pan-American Highway is no longer a local disaster. It's the first engagement in a war against Earth's own geological underworld. The only viable path forward now depends on high-level political intervention and a desperate, unauthorized Plan B. The realization that the entity is an intraterrestrial horror, a geological immune system rising from a deep-sea-like environment beneath the land bridge, instantly transforms the crisis from a Panamanian environmental disaster into a Level 6 global security event. You are now in the political war room, a secure, highly restricted video conference, where the diplomatic and military leaders of the world's most powerful nations are debating the entity, not as a threat, but as an opportunity. The immediate concern is the internal political and intelligence debates over managing the international crisis. The core strategy remains one of plausible deniability and doublespeak. The Panamanian government, terrified of global intervention and the effective loss of sovereignty over the gap, is maintaining the original cover story. Localized, aggressive geothermal activity. Meanwhile, the international partners, the United States, China, the UN Security Council members, are engaging in frantic back-channel negotiations. The key debate is not how to fight the entity, but who gets to control the information and the potential resources of the area. One delegation argues for immediate, transparent disclosure to mobilize global scientific resources. Another, far more powerful delegation argues for absolute secrecy, fearing that public panic would lead to geopolitical instability and a run on key mineral markets, especially since the entity's silicon boron structure suggests it might be consuming and concentrating rare earth elements. You listen to an audio feed of a highly secured diplomatic call. A US envoy, his voice clipped and cold, is articulating the strategy. We continue to fund Project Obsidian as a multinational environmental research initiative. We publicly praise the Panamanian efforts at containment. Privately, we classify the entity as a non-terrestrial biological asset, NTBA, and restrict all data to the Five Eyes partners, plus select scientific personnel. We need to maintain a plausible cover story that allows for intervention without admitting to a reality that breaks the known laws of physics. This strategic use of doublespeak is a direct echo of a mainstream historical fact regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. During that terrifying 13-day standoff, the US publicly maintained a firm, unyielding stance, while privately engaging in highly sensitive secret negotiations with the Soviet Union to trade missiles in Turkey for the withdrawal of missiles in Cuba. The public and private narratives were entirely separate, designed to manage national morale and geopolitical appearance, while the real work of de-escalation happened in the shadows. Here, the doublespeak manages to maintain the appearance of stability, while the core reality, the entity's terrifying growth, is addressed through classified, desperate measures. The terrifying update, "it's still growing," is now being spun into a political resource. Each metric of expansion translates into a higher level of threat, justifying greater and more secretive military and financial allocation to the research effort. The failure of containment becomes a successful justification for increased political control. You encounter a quirky or fringe tidbit circulating among the analysts who are modelling the political ripple effect. One theory, based on the historical concept of crisis exploitation, suggests that a specific faction within the intelligence community is intentionally letting the entity grow up to a critical but predetermined threshold. Their goal is to use the entity as a continental choke point justification, CCJ, a permanent natural barrier that would force the global reliance on the Panama Canal to be absolute, thus cementing the geopolitical importance of the nations that control the canal zone. The entity becomes a pawn in a terrifying high-stakes game of global strategic positioning. This theory posits that the growth isn't just an accident, it's an asset being reluctantly cultivated. The crucial scholarly debate being played out in this room is clear. Historians still argue whether the defining characteristic of modern global politics is cooperation toward common goals or constant competition for limited resources. The entity proves that even in the face of an existential, species-level threat, the primary instinct of powerful nations is not cooperation, but a renewed aggressive competition for control, resources, and strategic advantage. The entity is a force for geopolitical chaos, consuming the hope of unified global response. You make a tired, cynical light joke, muttering beneath your breath. Well, at least we know the entity's not going to run for office. It's far too honest about its desire to consume all complexity. The man who delivered the terrifying update was fully aware of this political posturing. He was the one responsible for synthesizing the raw, unadulterated field data for the International Intelligence Committee, the data that explicitly contradicted the public narrative of a manageable geothermal seep. His final encrypted burst didn't just contain the repeated metric of doom. It was a desperate attempt to bypass the political filter and warn the wider scientific community before the information was permanently suppressed. His "it's still growing" wasn't a scientific finding, it was a moral plea against political opportunism. The political fallout reaches a critical juncture when one nation, publicly aligned with the environmental research narrative, is discovered to have secretly dispatched an unapproved deep submergence vehicle to a known hydrothermal vent area in the Pacific, an attempt to acquire samples of the extreme pressure archaea, the natural enemy of the entity, without informing Project Obsidian. This act of brazen unilateralism shatters the fragile trust within the command centre and forces a final, desperate discussion on the ultimate non-conventional solution. If they can't trust each other, the only way forward is a massive, globally destructive option that no single nation can be blamed for. This opens the door to the unspeakable. The political fallout has paralysed conventional action. The entity's exponential growth, confirmed by the terrifying update, has pushed the crisis past the point where conventional military or even biological means can succeed on their own. The failure of containment, the psychological warfare, and the geopolitical infighting all point to one horrifying final option, the ultimate application of brute force. You are now present for the highly restricted internal debate concerning Operation Chimera. This classified meeting is held in a bunker far removed from Panama, a secure facility where the air is thick with the scent of fear and cold realism. The subject of the discussion is the reluctant consideration of using extreme, non-conventional force, including tactical nukes, against the Oculus material. The rationale for considering nuclear force is terrifyingly simple. The entity is consuming energy and complexity. It is immune to traditional chemical and physical attack because its entropic nature allows it to absorb and reorganize energy efficiently. A nuclear detonation, however, is a singular, massive, unstructured blast of energy and radiation. The hope is not to destroy the entity, but to overwhelm its capacity for entropic consumption, to hit it with so much chaotic energy so fast that it cannot reorganize the input, and is, momentarily, forced into a state of structural overload. The primary plan, Operation Chimera, involves deploying a low-yield, ground-penetrating tactical nuclear device beneath the entity's core, directly into the subterranean void identified by the geophysicists. The goal is to use the immense heat and pressure to seal the fissure feeding the surface growth, effectively cauterizing the entity's tap to the deep Earth reservoir. The risks, however, are almost unimaginable. The xenobiologists, Dr. Shaw foremost among them, are vehemently opposed. They argue that the entity's non-carbon silicon-boron structure is already incredibly resistant to thermal extremes. Instead of destroying it, the massive chaotic energy dump from the nuclear blast could simply give the entity an unprecedented feast of raw, disorganized energy. It could accelerate the entity's growth exponentially, transforming it from a localized continental threat into a global one by dramatically expanding its physical mass and psychological field. The blast, instead of creating an inert field of glass, could create a super-entropic monster. This is the ultimate ethical and strategic dilemma, one that echoes a mainstream historical fact from the dawn of the atomic age, the Manhattan Project. That massive, secretive effort in the 1940s operated under the terrifying theoretical possibility that the first nuclear test in New Mexico, the Trinity explosion, might not simply explode, but could trigger an uncontrollable chain reaction that would ignite the entire atmosphere, consuming the world in a fiery death. That historical fear, the catastrophic destruction of the planet by a theoretical overreach, is precisely the risk now being debated for Operation Chimera. They are contemplating a solution that might destroy the world in order to save it. The terrifying update, "It's still growing," is the chief argument of the military proponents. The entity's growth rate gives humanity perhaps 90 days before the physical mass and the psychological field are irreversible. They argue that waiting for a perfect solution, such as the biological gambit, is a luxury they no longer possess. They must employ the most powerful, if imperfect, weapon in the arsenal. The discussion quickly turns to the political deniability, or lack thereof. Using nuclear weapons on the Panamanian land bridge would be a global catastrophe, regardless of the outcome. This brings up a quirky or fringe tidbit from Cold War strategy, the concept of doomsday preppers for strategic advantage. During the height of the Soviet-US arms race, some strategists proposed that the Soviet Union would be uniquely positioned to survive a major nuclear exchange because its system of governance was already highly centralized and resilient to chaos, giving it a strategic post-apocalyptic advantage. Here, the planners are discussing how to frame the nuclear detonation not as an attack, but as a geoseismic stabilization effort to maintain the facade of control, even as they risk planetary consumption. The profound scholarly debate at the heart of this meeting is, historians still argue whether the invention of the atomic bomb represented humanity's greatest technological triumph or its greatest moral failure. For the officers in the bunker, the bomb now represents both. It is their ultimate tool for survival, but its deployment will be an unequivocal moral failure, confirming that in the face of true alien threat, humanity resorts to its most destructive impulse. You manage a grim third-light joke, a piece of dark strategic humour, as the graphics of the projected blast radius are displayed. Well, if we use the nuke, at least the entity won't be able to turn the mushroom cloud white. Too much complexity, even for it. The man whose terrifying update you're tracking was present at the periphery of this debate. His final, desperate encrypted transmission was a direct, unauthorized memo to Dr. Shaw's biological team. He didn't just repeat the growth metric, he included the code name for the nuclear plan, essentially turning his last update into an emergency moral alarm. He warned them that the military timetable was shrinking rapidly, and that if the biological solution was not deployed immediately, the world was going to risk incineration by the very people sworn to protect it. His "it's still growing" was a desperate plea for speed, a realization that the growth was leading inexorably to the nuclear option. The decision is tabled, a terrifying stalemate between the generals and the scientists. They will proceed with the preparations for Operation Chimera, but they will give the xenobiologists a final, extremely short window to deploy their radical, unproven counteragent. The fate of the Americas hangs on a few hours of frantic work in a makeshift lab, a biological gambit against a geological apocalypse. The terrifying prospect of Operation Chimera has granted Dr. Shaw's biological team a frantic final reprieve. But before the deployment of the unproven anti-agent, there is one last crucial piece of information to be analysed. The chilling possibility that the entity is not just a growing biological machine, but a deliberate communicating intelligence. You're examining the data retrieved from the perimeter just before the EMP field became totally impenetrable. The key finding is the discovery that the entity isn't just growing, but is emitting a complex, data-rich form of silent communication. This discovery was made by a specialised acoustic seismic team that used heavily shielded non-metallic sensors burrowed deep into the bedrock. They were attempting to monitor the pressure and expansion of the subterranean reservoir when they registered an anomaly, an ultra-low frequency ULF vibration, a structured wave below the threshold of human hearing that was being broadcast from the entire surface of the black mass. This isn't the random, chaotic noise of geological activity. It's a highly structured wave of silence. When the team managed to filter out the geological background noise and isolate the ULF signal, they found it was not static but a complex pulsating sequence of organised energy. The pattern of the signal matched the entity's fractal geometric growth patterns observed on the jungle floor. The entity was literally writing its intentions into the bedrock. The analysts quickly realised the entity's primary weapon, the silent shout, is not primarily a weapon at all. It is its language. The low-frequency E, MP and psychological dread are merely the side effects of this communication signal interacting violently with highly organised systems like human brains and complex electronics. When the human brain tries to process a signal that is fundamentally non-biological, non-linguistic and perfectly entropic, it collapses, resulting in the paralysis and petrification seen in the Pillars of Salt. The entity wasn't trying to kill the soldiers, it was simply trying to talk, and the soldiers were too complex to survive the conversation. This is a staggering realisation, and it immediately echoes a mainstream historical fact often pondered by linguists: the efforts to decipher ancient, complex scripts like the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was invaluable because it presented the same text in 3 different scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and ancient Greek, allowing scholars to finally unlock the logic of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Here, the scientists are trying to decipher the entity's signal, but they only have one script, the physical geometry of the entity's growth, to compare it against the auditory signal, and the conversation is deadly. The terrifying update, "It's still growing," is now understood as a self-reported status update. The entity isn't passively expanding, it's broadcasting its continuous successful self-replication to its subterranean reservoir and possibly to other unknown entities. The exponential growth is the result of a highly efficient, internally coordinated process. Dr. Shaw's team proposes a quirky or fringe tidbit that flips the entire conflict on its head. They suggest that the entity's ULF signal might be a form of communication known as trophic cascading signal, a signal meant not for consciousness-to-consciousness dialogue, but for ecosystem-to-ecosystem regulation. In this theory, the entity views the surrounding jungle as an overcomplex, thermodynamically unstable system. Its signal is a command to the environment to simplify, to reduce its entropy and complexity for the sake of long-term geological stability. The entity is not malicious. It is a hyper-efficient, self-correcting geological thermostat, and humanity is merely a temperature spike it is attempting to regulate. This revelation leads to a core scholarly debate about the very nature of existence. Historians still argue whether language is primarily a tool for communication or a tool for conceptual organisation and control. The entity's signal proves that the two can be one and the same. Its communication is control. The act of broadcasting the signal enforces the entropic collapse in the surrounding environment, structuring and organising the world toward its ultimate simplified form. The psychological warfare analyst, who has been quietly absorbing this new data, offers a stunning counterintuitive insight. If the entity is communicating its intent, then perhaps the solution lies not in fighting its physical form, but in corrupting its language. They suggest using the Balatar acoustic shields, the singing trees, not just to block the silent shout, but to broadcast a custom-designed, chaotic, high-entropy signal, a form of linguistic sabotage. If they feed the entity a signal that is random, meaningless, and thermodynamically inefficient, it might overload its organizational processor without providing the massive chaotic energy that would risk a nuclear escalation. You manage a slightly strained light joke, the kind that only people facing existential dread can appreciate. So we're fighting the most advanced alien life form on the planet with noise pollution. Just imagine the geological equivalent of holding the remote control too close to the TV. The man whose terrifying update you're tracking was the unsung hero who noticed the recurring patterns in the seismic data. His last encrypted transmission didn't just mention the entity's growth, he included a tiny digital audio file containing the filtered ULF signal. He had annotated the file with a single desperate warning. The noise, it repeats. It is demand. I think it's telling us to be quiet. His ultimate message, "It's still growing," was a terrifying confirmation that the entity's demands were not being met, and its communication was becoming a relentless physical force. Now, armed with the knowledge of its language, the team has one final shot at a surgical strike, a combined biological and linguistic gambit, before the generals pull the trigger on Operation Chimera. The frantic preparation for the combined biological and linguistic strike is underway. But the discovery of the entity's communication signal, the trophic cascading signal, has reopened the historical archives with a terrifying new purpose. If the entity is a recurring geological event, there must be human records of its past outbreaks, not just in ancient myths, but in documented history. You are now sifting through colonial-era Spanish archives, looking for an echo of the Black Sludge. The search focuses on the deep interior of the Darien Gap, the one region of Panama the Spanish never truly conquered or settled, largely due to the impassable terrain and fierce resistance from the indigenous peoples, a mainstream historical fact often overshadowed by the conquest of more, organised empires like the Aztec and Inca. However, the thirst for gold drove multiple, doomed expeditions into the Gap's heart during the 16th and 17th centuries. The archival team strikes gold, ironically, by uncovering the bizarre fate of a forgotten Spanish colonial settlement established in 1698 called Santa Maria de la Tierra Firme. This outpost was briefly established by a Scottish colonial venture known as the Darien Scheme, a historical detail that makes the tragedy even more poignant given its later spectacular failure due to disease and logistics. The Spanish records, however, focused on the sudden and complete annihilation of a smaller internal settlement of Spanish prospectors located suspiciously close to the current exclusion zone, roughly 200 years before the Scots arrived. The settlement, whose name is illegible in the brittle documents, was a temporary gold prospecting camp. The last surviving communication, a handwritten journal entry by a Spanish captain dated 1702, describes a scene hauntingly familiar to the Pillars of Salt. The captain wrote of his men suddenly falling silent, their movements slowing to a crawl. He described a dark, viscous mud that did not burn when torches were placed upon it, and which drank the shine from our silver and gold. He noted that the prospectors, consumed by a profound dread, began throwing their accumulated lost gold and silver artifacts into a pit, screaming that the metal was singing the songs of the dead. He observed his lieutenant standing guard, then freezing instantly, his face turning, the colour of bone, yet not dead. You realise the chilling connection. This sudden demise of the colonial settlement is connected to a similar unexplained event, a previous smaller emergence of the oculus material. The description is a perfect colonial-era translation of the entity's core mechanisms, the non-Newtonian black mass, the entropic consumption, drinking the shine from silver, the psychological terror, singing the songs of the dead, and the instant petrification, the face the colour of bone. The prospector's instinct to discard their gold reinforces the Embera warning and the archaeological evidence from Section 3. The entity's magnetic field and entropic consumption are somehow amplified by complex metallic structures, especially gold. The settlers weren't discarding wealth. They were trying to decomplicate their environment in a futile attempt to survive the entity's organisational radar. This archival discovery provides a crucial mainstream historical fact regarding colonial expansion: the often overlooked environmental cost of the initial colonial gold rushes. While most historical narratives focus on disease and warfare, the sheer, sudden demand for gold, often extracted through highly disruptive methods, could have provided the first significant complex energy source, the gyra disruption mentioned by the Embera, needed to awaken the deep earth entity. The entity, in this sense, is an ancient geological retribution for colonial greed. The journal also contains a perplexing quirky or fringe tidbit. The captain claimed the entity, before consuming his lieutenant, began to form letters of glass on its surface, which he could not read. This is a direct parallel to the complex fractal geometry the xenobiologists observed on the oculus material. The captain's letters of glass are likely the visible silicon-boron scaffolding, the low-entropy structure of the entity, which our modern scientists now understand is part of its communication and replication process. The entity isn't just speaking through ULF vibrations, it's writing in a visual alien script. The terrifying update, it's still growing, is now imbued with the weight of centuries. The man who transmitted the data was likely unaware that his observation was a repeat of a 300-year-old catastrophe. His raw metrics are simply the modern, scientific articulation of the dread felt by a colonial captain witnessing the complete collapse of his reality. This historical evidence brings the core scholarly debate into sharp focus. Historians still argue whether the primary cause of European colonial failure in places like the Darien Gap was logistical incompetence, native resistance, or disease. The colonial captain's journal introduces a fourth, terrifying factor, an aggressive, indigenous geological life form that resists all foreign, organised complexity. The jungle didn't just passively defeat the colonisers, it contained a force that actively consumed them. You manage a deeply morbid light joke, feeling the crushing weight of the historical repetition. Looks like the entity is a massive geological anti-archivist. It hates historical records and complex financial transactions. It's the ultimate tax evasion scheme. The attempt at humour is a necessary shield against the thought that history is just a loop, and humanity is doomed to repeat the same entropic mistake. The most critical information gleaned from this archive is that the previous outbreak stopped. The colonial settlement was annihilated, but the entity eventually receded, leaving behind only the bleached bones and the terrifying silence. This suggests the entity is either cyclical or requires a massive complex input to sustain its surface growth, and once that fuel source, the colonial prospectors, their gold, and their complex machinery, was exhausted, it returned to its subterranean slumber. This provides a glimmer of hope. The entity is not infinite. It can be starved. The entire strategy now pivots on this single, 300-year-old fact. Containment is impossible, but starvation is achievable. The weight of history, from the Emperor myths to the doomed Spanish prospectors, now rests on the shoulders of the frantic team preparing the final, two-pronged counterattack. You are back in the mobile command centre, the air thick with the inevitability of Operation Chimera looming in the background. Every eye is on the monitors displaying the latest agonising telemetry from the field, the data that constitutes the terrifying update from the man who broke ranks. The man, a high-level intelligence analyst named Marcus Thorne, risked everything to send his final encrypted burst. He wasn't on the field to collect samples, he was on the field to monitor the rate of military failure and to prepare the justification for the nuclear option. But what he witnessed broke his military conditioning and turned him into a desperate whistleblower. His update is a combination of raw, irrefutable metrics and a professional's despairing analysis. The terrifying update he delivered detailed the continuous, accelerating growth and the complete failure of the last-ditch containment efforts, confirming that the entity had reached a new critical threshold. The key metric was the expansion of the entropic field. Thorne reported that the radius of the silent shout, the psychological weapon and organisational radar, had expanded by an additional 15% in the last 12 hours. This meant that the entity was gaining complexity-consuming territory faster than its physical mass was spreading. It was winning the psychological war and effectively enforcing a massive no-go zone that pushed the last human observation post back a staggering 5 miles. Thorne's data confirmed the failure of the electromagnets, the desperate attempt to repel the black mass with a structured external magnetic field. The entity, instead of being repelled, seemed to integrate the energy. The non-metallic ceramic-cased magnets didn't turn white. They began to hum in sync with the entity's ULF communication signal, and the black mass flowed around the field, treating the energy as an irritating but ultimately minor obstacle. This confirmed that the entity's magnetic manipulation was so sophisticated, it could actively nullify or even harvest external magnetic inputs. He included a heart-stopping image, a zoomed-in photograph of the Pan-American Highway sign you saw earlier. It was no longer just chalky white, it had completely crumbled. The entire structure, steel pole, aluminum sign, paint, had been reduced to a small mound of inert, fine white dust. This was a physical demonstration that the entity's entropic field was now capable of achieving complete deorganization of complex matter at a distance of over half a mile. The entity no longer needed to physically touch its target. It could simply broadcast the entropic collapse via its ULF signal. The ultimate silent killer had gone airborne. His accompanying text was stark. The physical containment has failed, the magnetic countermeasure is fuel, and the psychological field is now so pervasive that communication within the exclusion zone is collapsing. We are fighting a force that is turning the physics of life into dust at range. The only solution remaining on this timetable is Chimera. Thorne's analysis then shifted to the biological threat. He reported the entity had consumed a massive section of the Balatar Grove, the singing trees that the Embera myths claimed it hated. The trees, instead of deterring it with their low-frequency acoustic energy, had simply been consumed faster than the surrounding jungle. The entity had treated the highly organized, complex cellular structure of the specialized tree as a concentrated food source. It was a complete repudiation of the indigenous warning, suggesting that while the myth was based on a real event, the entity had either evolved or that its current emergence was far more powerful than the 18th century outbreak. This is where his professional detachment broke. He ended the report with a desperate personal plea to Dr. Shaw, the xenobiologist. Dr. Shaw, your chemical weapon must be faster than the timetable. We're out of time. The General Staff has a confirmed strike window. If your low-entropy molecule fails, they will launch. It's still growing. I can hear it now, even from here. It's quiet, and it's hungry. The phrase, "it's still growing," repeated throughout his transmission, was no longer a metric. It was an epitaph. It meant that the geological tap was not slowing, the psychological field was not shrinking, and the inevitable moment of nuclear reckoning was upon them. You realise a grim mainstream historical fact often taught in military academies. The concept of the fog of war, coined by the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz. This refers to the uncertainty in situational awareness that pervades military operations, where critical information is often obscured by error, misdirection, and chaos. Thorne's update was the complete and total lifting of the fog of war, a chilling clarity revealing that the enemy was not confused or chaotic. It was operating with perfect efficiency, and the only remaining uncertainty was human error. The quirky or fringe tidbit that emerges in the wake of Thorne's sacrifice is the analysis of the final image he sent, a selfie taken in front of the collapsing highway sign. His face, though strained and terrified, did not show the signs of cognitive simplification syndrome. Dr. Shaw hypothesized that Thorne's very act of self-aware, unauthorized rebellion, the complex moral decision to betray his command to save millions, had generated a momentary, highly energetic psychological state that temporarily repelled the silent shout. His moral complexity was his temporary shield. The core scholarly debate, as the military technicians begin their final checks on the launch procedures for Operation Chimera, becomes acutely existential. Historians still argue whether the greatest force for change in history is the rise of technology or the exercise of moral courage. In the final hour, the only thing standing against the ultimate technological threat, the nuclear bomb, and the ultimate anti-life force, the entity, is the moral courage of one man's leaked memo, giving the scientist one last tiny window. Dr. Shaw, her eyes blazing with exhaustion and determination, stands before the command team. The entity has consumed the Balatar Grove. It has rejected the magnetic field. It is now consuming complexity at a distance. The nuclear option is suicide. We will proceed with the biological and linguistic gambit now. You manage one final, strained light joke, acknowledging the sheer absurdity of the situation. So, the entire fate of North and South America now rests on a bucket of simple silicon goo and a boombox playing white noise. That's probably the least impressive last stand in history. The entity's current size is estimated to be over 12 square miles, and its psychological field covers over 200 square miles. The sheer scale of the terror is now visible from orbit. The terrifying update has delivered its final fatal message. The entity's growth is a countdown. The time for deliberation is over. The only thing left to do is gamble. The clock is ticking down to the moment the generals will authorize Operation Chimera. Marcus Thorne's sacrifice has bought Dr. Shaw and her team mere hours to deploy their radical solution. You're observing the final mission briefing, a scene of taut, silent desperation. The ultimate defense against the anti-life entity is not a bomb or a laser, but a radical, unproven biological counteragent, the Silica Scaffolding 7, combined with an acoustic countermeasure. This is the biological gambit. The plan is audacious and simple, mirroring the entity's own philosophy of elegant simplicity. The goal is no longer to destroy the entity, but to reverse its entropic consumption by overloading its organizational radar, the silent shout, while simultaneously introducing a contaminant that makes its replication process unstable and thermodynamically inefficient to essentially give the entity a severe case of biological indigestion. The two-pronged attack is based on the enemy's most vulnerable characteristic, its absolute dependence on organization. Phase 1. Linguistic sabotage. A highly shielded, non-metallic drone will fly to the edge of the expanded entropic field, near the source of the entity's ULF signal. Its payload is not a bomb, but a massive array of specialized ceramic loudspeakers. These speakers will broadcast a custom-designed acoustic signal, a form of linguistic sabotage. This signal is the sonic equivalent of static, a high-entropy, complex and random sound wave engineered to exactly match the ULF frequency of the entity's trophic cascading signal, but with one crucial difference: absolute meaninglessness. The entity's ULF broadcast is a command to the environment to simplify. The counter-signal is a command to the environment to be chaotic. The hope is that this chaotic input will temporarily overload the entity's organizational processing unit, effectively deafening its radar and scrambling its ability to target and consume complex matter, thus pausing the entropic field expansion. You recall that dark joke about fighting it with noise pollution. Now that dark joke is the primary weapon. Phase 2. Biological contamination. Simultaneously, a small two-person team in fully sealed non-metallic ceramic exoskeletons, the last best hope of the Project Obsidian field team, will enter the perimeter. Their mission is to deploy the Silica Scaffolding 7. The Silica Scaffolding 7 is a low-entropy polymer derived from deep-sea extremophiles. It is a silicon-boron chain that is structurally similar to the entity's backbone but is chemically inert and lacks the organizational components necessary to harvest energy. The team will spray a dense, aerosolized cloud of this polymer directly onto the leading edge of the black mass. The theory, Dr. Shaw's final desperate hypothesis, is that the entity, blinded and confused by the linguistic sabotage, will absorb the inert polymer. The biological gambit is that the entity's organizational process will attempt to integrate this low-entropy contaminant, treating it as a raw building block. But because the Scaffolding 7 is chemically stable and provides no entropic energy return, the entity will waste vast amounts of energy attempting to organize a molecule that refuses to be organized. It will be like a highly complex engine attempting to run on dirt. The growth will not just stop, it will be forced into reverse as the entity expends more energy trying to maintain its unstable growth matrix than it gains from the linguistic overload. The mainstream historical fact that frames the extreme urgency of this deployment is the narrative of the Apollo 13 crisis in 1970. When the crew's oxygen tank exploded, the mission shifted entirely to damage control and problem-solving with limited resources. The engineers on the ground had to invent a filter to clean the toxic air using only materials available on the spacecraft. A triumph of simple, low-tech ingenuity under impossible pressure. Dr. Shaw's team is performing a biological version of this. They are forced to use the simplest, least effective components to defeat an enemy that thrives on complexity, hoping that ingenuity, not brute force, will prevail. As the team prepares to deploy, a terrifying, final quirky or fringe tidbit is presented. Dr. Shaw believes that the entity's current hyper-aggressive state is not an evolution, but a defense mechanism. She suggests that the entity, by sensing the impending nuclear strike, Operation Chimera, has somehow calculated the massive chaotic energy dump and is accelerating its growth to prepare to absorb the blast. She calls it the thermodynamic brace. If this is true, the entity is demonstrating not just instinct, but predictive, calculated intelligence, and the nuclear option would be a deliberate self-sacrifice by the entity to consume the world. The drone launches, and the two-person team, moving like heavily armoured ghosts, enters the entropic zone. You hear the final desperate communication from the deployment team leader, Captain Chen. His voice is tight, his breathing heavy, battling the cognitive paralysis of the silent shout even through the neural shielding. He confirms the drone has reached its target altitude and is broadcasting the chaotic, linguistic sabotage signal, a sound that, even filtered through the comms, is a jarring random static. Signal is live, they're getting the noise. On the main screen the readings are instantaneous. The ultra-low frequency ULF signal, the entity's communication, stutters. The rhythmic, organised pulses momentarily dissolve into chaotic white noise. The expansion of the entropic field instantly halts. The red line on the map, which has been inexorably moving forward, stops dead. Then, Captain Chen reports the deployment of the Scaffolding 7. Agent is deployed. Aerosol cloud is visible on thermal. Contact with the black mass confirmed. For 10 excruciating minutes, nothing happens. The generals in the bunker are on the verge of aborting the plan and initiating the Chimera launch sequence. The only thing stopping them is the scientific reading. The entity's growth hasn't accelerated, It is merely holding steady. Then it begins. Not an explosion, but a withdrawal. Along the edges of the black mass, a faint white vapour begins to rise, the expelled organisational energy. The surface of the oculus material, instead of its usual glossy black, takes on a dull, unstable, mottled grey. The geometric fractal patterns along the edges, the visual script, begin to blur and recede, like writing being erased from a cosmic blackboard. The black mass is spending more energy resisting the inert polymer contamination and the chaotic linguistic attack than it is gaining from the surrounding environment. It is starving itself. The final, triumphant scholarly debate is settled not in a textbook, but on the field. Historians still argue whether ultimate victory in conflict is achieved through superior offensive capability or superior defensive resilience. The biological gambit proves that the entity's entropic nature, its dependence on energy and complexity, is also its greatest weakness. By forcing it into a high-energy, low-gain defence, Dr. Shaw's simple, elegant solution achieves what no bomb or barrier could. The final update, the one that reverses all the prior terror, comes from Captain Chen, his voice now clearer, the silent shout receding. He whispers, "The mass is contracting." I repeat, the mass is contracting. It's consuming itself. The terrifying update has been inverted. The black mass is shrinking, slowly but measurably, pulling its edges away from the petrified soil, the inert scaffolding 7 forcing it to deorganize its surface area to feed its core. The threat is not gone, but it is receding. The last transmission from Marcus Thorne, the man who gave his moral courage to buy this time, is now a testament to their victory. His phrase, "It's still growing," has been replaced by the triumphant reality of the biological gambit. The frantic energy of the command centre begins to dissipate, replaced by a weary, almost sacred silence. You watch the holographic map for a long time, tracing the slowly shrinking circumference of the black mass. The red line inching backward toward the original emergence point. The jungle, no longer under the immediate oppression of the entropic field, is tentatively beginning to hum again, a chorus of faint insectile sound filtering back into the command centre. The crisis is not over. The entity has retreated, but its massive subterranean tap is only capped, not destroyed. It lies waiting, once again dormant beneath the ancient soil, reminded that its reign is conditional. We learned tonight that the Earth holds secrets far older and far more fundamentally hostile than we ever imagined, and that sometimes the most sophisticated defence is achieved through the most radical simplicity, a handful of silicon dust and a loud noise. As the last of the operational teams begin their long, slow withdrawal from the Darien Gap, take a moment to absorb this. The world was saved not by overwhelming power, but by a complex moral decision and an understanding of the simple chemistry of life. Let that thought drift through your mind as you settle deeper into your pillow, knowing that for tonight the shadow without roots has been forced back into its silent, deep earth slumber. The complex world remains, for now, intact.